Let's see. Yes. So welcome everybody to our second international automation user group meeting. The agenda today is, in my opinion, quite interesting. It has more or less nothing to do with VMware, which is a bit odd from my point of view anyway. But I'm actually really looking forward to learning some new stuff, and yeah, I think it would be hard not to. So we'll kick it off with Cody, and I won't go into the details. You can see those, and we have Tim Davies after that, Chip Zoller, and then in the end we have Nico and Patrick doing some coding stuff. So I actually attended that one some time ago internally, and that was quite good. So if you can, wait to that one. I think it would be hard to actually record it, but that's it. Again, if you want to find any information after this call, then go to our website, automationusergroup.io, and that's also where we'll put all the recordings here, and I'll put up segments, etc. So if you just want to see one of the presentations, you don't have to scroll through it. So it's quite easy. And then again, if you have any questions, I'll monitor the chat. Remember to mute yourself, or else we will. If you want to put the webcam on, from my point of view, I like actually seeing people. It's kind of nice. If you don't want to, then that's fine as well. And then I will let you know, that's mostly for the speakers. We'll try to keep the time as good as we can. You have around 45 minutes each. So that's it. We don't have a date for the next meeting, but I'm guessing in around 3 months we'll find something to talk about. So that's it. Let's begin.
Cool. I will kick sharing into gear and do my thing.
Perfect.
I think I'm sharing the Zoom though.
I think it looks good.
Yeah. So I'm going to assume everyone sees what they're supposed to see, and if they don't, they'll yell at me otherwise. So I'm going to do intros in a moment. This is going to be a little bit of a different presentation for me. For people who know me, I'm actually not going to do a demo for once. I'm going to talk kind of more broadly about automation and how that's impacted my life, and some perspectives around how you can take automation and engage 600 and beyond, and what that means will come up soon enough. So let's jump in. Maybe. There we go. So who am I? For those who don't know me, my name is Cody Arkland. Most of the people who do know me from my time at VMware or in the automation community. Before that, when I was on the customer side. These days, I work for Kong, so that we're a cloud connectivity company. We kind of specialize in creating ways to connect applications between environments, and specifically, I work in the office of the CTO. I do a lot of service mesh work and kind of driving awareness around that product. This presentation overall is not about that. I do think that there's a hefty part of service mesh that ties into automation, and it's something that doesn't get talked about very much. And I'll touch on that later on in the presentation, but just kind of framing out kind of what I do and where I'm at. If you ever want to engage me, I know there's several people on here that'll vouch for this. I love catching up with people. I love talking about really anything, but some specific topics are listed below. Hit me up on Twitter, drop into DMs. We can jump on a Zoom sometime. I love catching up with people in the community. I love talking about this stuff. So definitely reach out. I'm way easy to get a hold of on Twitter. It's easier to get a hold of me there than it is than text messaging me or emailing me. So things I love talking about. I'm a huge proponent of kindness. Something that's kind of grown in my life, and I talk a lot about, and you'll see me reference it a lot in social media. I always try to lead with that. I think that I can always remember the people who were kind to me and the people who took time. And it just so happens that most of the people presenting today were people who have had exceptional levels of kindness with me in the past. So it's really cool to be able to present with everybody. So I always lead with kindness. I love talking about that concept and kind of walking through ideas around that. So always happy to have a conversation around that. I love talking about mentorship, both people mentoring me as well as helping pass along lessons, whether that's fun tech stuff and we jump on and hack at Python together for a while, or you have questions around things like evangelism or tech marketing or developer relations or any of these things. I love mentorship. I love talking careers. So you're always welcome to reach out about that. I'm a huge proponent for mental health. I talk a lot about my own struggles with anxiety, my own struggles with kind of fighting my place in this world and how to interact in this world. So confidential conversations are always cool with me. We can always talk about that stuff if you have questions, thoughts, or you just want to dump some stuff out. I'm always there for it. On the more techie side, I love talking service mesh. I have a love-hate relationship with it at times, but I do love helping people understand what I think is actually the value prop there and why it's actually useful. So I'm always happy to answer questions on that. Kubernetes, cloud things. I didn't list Python out here, but anyone who's attended any of my sessions knows I'll chat about Python all day long. But ultimately, like, my true deep passion is automation and automation across kind of all things. That's what makes me really excited. This user group is starting to pick up some steam. Is that I think that it's been kind of a missing or a gap that's existed in the community around a topic that ultimately has changed so many people's careers. I think I can look on the list of presenters and say that every one of them has been very positively impacted by taking an automation first approach towards things. So that's who I am. That was a lot longer than I like intro slides to be, because you're not really here to hear me talk about myself. You're here to hear me talk about the topic. So, but that's me. So a thought that I want you to kind of, as you go through the session today, as you listen in on some really cool presentations, you're going to see some great tech today. I went through and looked at the descriptions. There's some really cool stuff you're gonna learn about. But I think that everyone presenting would agree that the most powerful automation tool you have is the way you approach problems, and it's the thought process that you put behind the things you're trying to accomplish. A good example of this is when I was very early in kind of what I call workflow driven automation, where you're kind of building processes to accomplish tasks and things. I was on a team. I was very, very early in automation career. Like, Cody with Python hadn't even started yet. And I remember we spent several months trying to automate builds of an Oracle rack deployment. And ultimately, when we came back and looked at we never succeeded at it. Kind of in story of that is we were never able to get it to work. But ultimately, what ended up happening is we came back and looked at it, and over the course of a year, we were only deploying 2 to 3 of these on average for the previous 3 years. And when we re-looked at our thought process around that, the question became, is it really worth it to invest all of this time, 3 months of dev time, hacking, trying bash scripts, trying playbooks, moving things around, only to ultimately to have something that's used 2 or 3 times a year? At the end of the day, the reason we were only deploying 2 or 3 times a year was not because of the cumbersome aspects of deploying it. It was just because it wasn't used that often. Always think about automation from a thought process perspective and the process you're trying to accomplish. It's the most powerful tool you'll ever have. It'll blow any of the tools that we're all going to talk about today completely out of the water if you can take an idea and a concept and decompose it down into addressable blocks. There's always a tool that will fit into those addressable blocks, but hone your thought process, hone your behaviors, hone the way you approach problems, and the characteristics you use as a part of that. And I'll touch on some of those that work for me later on. But just keep that in mind, that your thought process is the powerful thing here. Vendors will always build tools. There'll always be something new and cool. Your thought process is what makes you powerful. So just for fun, this was you're going to find out now what the engaging 600 is about. So we're going to take a step back and we're going to think about a cinematic masterpiece. Batman Begins, Christian Bale, Liam Neeson, circa 2008. So I always think about this scene, and it in a funny sort of way, it really reminds me of automation. And you think about when Bruce gets up into the mountains and he's training with the League of Shadows, and he's with Liam Neeson, and he's starting to get trained. He's starting to learn kind of the art of what ultimately becomes Batman. And Ra's al Ghul says something to him. It's right after Bruce fights those the bad guys in the prison, and he goes, you can fight 6 men, but we can teach you to engage 600. And in a funny sort of way, this always made me think of automation. I think that their administrators I remember being this administrator who I would go through and I would manually click through this deployment, and I'd come home and I'd be like, yeah, I crushed it. I deployed 12 machines today. Life is great. But it was this manual thing. And when I look back on that now and I look at small behaviors that I could have changed, and ultimately I learned these lessons and I grew as an admin, and we all start somewhere, and that's fine. I think many of us who have learned those skills could engage 600 in that example. So the key takeaway from this phrase is that automation teaches you how to engage in mass, and it teaches you how to engage huge pools of people to where ultimately the number doesn't really matter that much. You're limited by the time it takes for a task to run, and you're certainly limited by the power of the systems you're using to automate, but ultimately you're not held back by an ability to accomplish the task. And I think that that's what kind of engaging 600 and beyond is about, is how do we take these behaviors and translate them into things that help us be able to scale in that way. I talk about scale later on. Scale is an interesting word. We always talk about scale in the concept of, huge amounts of systems, right? We talk about, can my service mesh support 60,000 pods and 60,000 services, or can this VMC instance take 1,500 VMs and survive? Can it handle the load of 55 replicating databases or whatever, right? We talk about scale in that mind, but scale means a lot of different things. There's my scale as an administrator in the systems that I can interact with, and that's like this example in the picture here is as Cody, how many systems can I scale to engage with? There's the scale of how my team works together, right? There's a difference between Cody working in a silo by himself and Cody, Michael, and Robert and Chip all working on a team together also. That's a different kind of scale. And then there's another kind of scale where you have those clusters of groups living inside of different teams, all operating and using a different platform. So I think that there's certainly a bigger picture around what scale means and being able to engage at scale. So with that being said, I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about where my journey started and where I kind of first dipped my toe in the water of automation. So I've talked about this a lot, and I historically stayed away from the company name, not for any reason, not because anyone told me I had to, just felt weird to go way back. But my first foray into like a career of automation was at a major utility on the West Coast called Pacific Gas and Electric, and I actually had to go dig through my backups on my NAS to find this presentation. This was my first VMworld presentation ever, and I did it. It was it's funny how things work. Anyone who works inside the vendor space knows that getting conference talks for your customers is a tricky thing. I was put forward through the NSX track to talk about automation. So I was a NSX presentation technically, but ultimately it was all about automation. It was all about driving automated environments with NSX, VRA. This was 6.0 at that point, and VRO. So that team, which started in July 2015, was my first real job that was centered around automation. And we were charged with getting not just virtual machines deployed in an automated fashion. We were charged with getting applications loaded onto those machines. So when somebody requested, they no longer requested a Linux VM, they requested a MySQL database, or they requested the Oracle RAC database example, or they requested an IIS server, an Apache web server. So it was kind of the first foray into application deployments and how we actually get a useful thing in someone's hand, but then also the security constructs and all that behind it. And this is where that thought process really started to come in useful, because, or not to say useful, it's a place where I fell down repeatedly learning how to develop a good thought process around it. Because when you start to look at how you get something useful in front of somebody, especially in enterprise, it's not as simple as just deploy VM and install Apache. That's what we do in our home labs. That's the fun thing we do when we're just hacking about things on the weekend. But in the enterprise, there's security permissions that have to be set up on the virtual machine itself. There's agents that have to be installed. There's configurations that need to be made specific to the applications being deployed. So we got to this place where we were starting to decompose all of these tasks and figure out how to chain them together into kind of a workflow driven approach. And I use workflow not to reference VRO, although I'm still a huge fan of VRO. I think that I think that the ways I interact with environments have changed, and I don't lean on VRO at all these days, but I certainly respect the abilities that it brought and the ways that it changed my career and the ways it made my world bigger by realizing like workflow driven automation. But I think that it was interesting to look at how that was the first time where I took long sets of complex tasks and chained them together and learned about how to actually address a bigger problem as smaller chunks. So it's easy to trace back to kind of where my formal job started, but in reality, it didn't actually start there. There was a lot of things that happened that led me to that role and led me to that opportunity. I think about things like as a very junior admin before I even really had access to broader systems and being able to go in and locally restart services or locally change things on services for specific teams. And this very basic task ultimately led up to a place where I was building remote reboot scripts. And it's very basic when you start to decompose it this way, but these things start to build into bigger lessons. From that remote reboot script, how do I take that and start to orchestrate a cluster of systems? The example on this was I used to run a Citrix environment at that same utility, and we needed to go ahead and rotate reboots on our Citrix servers just to clean up stale connections, clean out issues with roaming profiles, stuff like that. Getting to a point where I could fire off this script and have it run as a scheduled task, once a day, once a week, that would individually drain out these servers, reboot them, bring them back into the cluster, and then move on to the next. That was a complex task at the time, but it all started with me figuring out the scripted process for just restarting a service locally on the box. So these things build on each other and they become bigger things. I remember a project where I went through and had to do a lot of license remediation on a RSA secure ID platform. I used to manage when I was one of my earliest jobs was a product manager for RSA secure ID at the utility company, and going in and remediating licenses out manually, going into the database and pruning out these ancient licenses that were assigned to people who hadn't been with the company for many years at that point. But this led me to a place where I started really interacting using scripting and bringing variables in and starting to use date ranges and play with different fields directly from a database and chaining those into a script that ran externally and interacting with that database directly. At this point, I'm not even touching APIs. At this point in my career, I don't even know what an API is. It's a mystery construct that lives in the dark realm from beyond. Like I have no idea what to do with it. But at this point, I'm still starting to script and I'm starting to play with how to interact with an environment at scale. Now, this is another definition of scale because I'm only interacting with one system, but I'm interacting with many records within one system. So something to think about. I have this friend, and I tell the story a lot to people who are learning to code. I think that any of us who came into coding not as their primary career or not as their primary goal could probably have a similar story to this. I have this friend, he was at my wedding. We were really good friends named Steve Carnes. And I kid you not, every 2 weeks, I would hit this guy up and say, hey, I need you to build me a report. Steve is a great web dev. He understood how to build really cool reports dynamically and do really interesting things. And I'd reach out to him every 2 weeks. Hey, I've got some stuff going on in my Citrix environment. Can you help me build a report? Hey, I'm doing stuff in my cloud environment. Can you help me build a web page that people can go and look at? And he had his own job, and eventually he just got too busy for it. So eventually this led to me starting to play in APIs, starting to play in Python and Flask, and starting to write my own web pages and learn how to do that. And this is a different talk for a different day. This box represents a massive change in where my career trajectory was. Grant Orchard and I talk a lot about level up moments in your career where you figure something out, and it's just former World of Warcraft player, when you level up and you get all these new skills, like Python and Flask was probably the biggest level up in my career by a country mile. But that was another level of automation and starting to get into where I could pull records from an API and start to dump those back to a web page that people could look at and interact with, and placing buttons on there that would let people change things about them. That was a pretty pivotal moment for me. And then the infamous clicky click server deployment, where we're going through manually, moving through those 12 machines a day and feeling really good about yourself, but then really moving into all your API or belong to me, where you're interacting with these systems at scale, and you figured out how to tap into deploying a machine via the REST API, and then tapping into the Infoblox API to go ahead and do the DNS registration, and then chaining into another automation task that reaches out and creates a user in the global directory, and chaining these things together in such a way that represents a full workflow. And when you start to combine all of these tasks together, it's things that I did all long before I was actually on that private cloud team. But ultimately, the in story there is I was automating things long before I ended up on that team. It just so happens that at a certain point, it became my job. There's a big career lesson here that I touched on Twitter not too long back, I think. And it's that you never really know where you're going to end up. I think that it's really interesting because when I joined the utility, I told the story to Liz Bronson recently. I will tell you, the first year of being there, my dream job was to be a product manager for cellular devices. Like it's a funny thing to say now, and everyone out here is having a good chuckle over that. But this was, and when I say cellular devices, I legit mean cellular devices. I'm not saying smartphones. I'm not saying tablets. Like this was, I came from Verizon, and that's what I knew. You never know where you're going to end up. You never know the technologies you're going to be exposed to, the people who are going to take a chance on you, the moments of kindness that are going to lead to a curiosity that's going to spark a fire and lead you down a path. You never know how that stuff's going to play out. So embrace those moments, learn from them, learn things. I talk about that in an upcoming slide here. But you never know how that stuff's going to play out long term. You never know when those skills and those talents are going to be valuable. When I started coding, I slammed my head into a wall over and over again, but I felt like there was something there, and I dug at it, and it's rewarded my career tenfold, and it's made me a better automator. It's made me a better engineer. It's made me a better thinker outside of the coding world, where I'm just trying to live my best life. So something to think about. So talking about an automation mindset, this is stuff that works for me. This are some thoughts that I had around how I teach people to automate, and how I kind of coach people through this stuff when they send me a DM and ask me, hey, how do I get to that kind of a place also? A big one for me is creating scale. Scale, I use this word as a very big variable. Because scale means a lot of things. I touched on that already. I like to think of scale as a way to make your world bigger and change the way that you interact with that world. All right. So there are technologies that make your world bigger, things like Terraform and things like Kong and things like VRA. These make your world so much bigger and create a whole different scale for you. Look at those things and look at the things that make you able to scale better, but also look at scale both in how you work as well. Look at how you're saving your code, and I talk on that in a few moments here as well. Look at how you're interacting with your peers, how you're creating relationships and doing collaboration. These are all ways that we create scale, and we scale ourselves beyond what we're doing today. Commit all. I wish somebody would have sat me down in my earlier days and said, hey, make sure you save every script you write, every block of code you build, or every automated task you make. Put that even if it's in a text file dropped into the /NAS drive on the company share. There's so much stuff that I never thought people would care about, or I didn't feel like was very good, or I didn't feel like it was very interesting, that I chucked in the recycle bin that would have been useful down the road. And it's also useful to go back and see things you did to understand where you're going. Commit everything, save everything, drop that in Git. Private repositories are free. Go build, right? So commit everything. It opens up a lot of doors for collaboration. It opens up a lot of doors for knowledge transfer, knowledge sharing. It's a good thing. Everything is code. This one is a relatively more recent add to this, and I've definitely grown to appreciate codifying things in my tech world, whether it's infrastructure using like a Terraform or a Pulumi or something like that to build out larger environments, whether it's my coded processes for going out and reaching out and interacting with an API. I think that embracing the as code is a way that we create scale with systems we interact with. I do that in Service Mesh. I talk about that a lot around how we do progressive delivery, how we deliver applications. The idea that storing the code definitions of the systems that run alongside your application and the expected operating parameters of that alongside the application is the right way to go. Embrace the as code mindset. Look at technologies that let you interact as code. It's valuable skill set to have. And this one's a big one. You know, I see a lot of people who they'll talk about learning something and then they'll feel a moment of embarrassment that I'm never going to figure this out. That's the point. Like, if you're not getting to a point where as you learn, you're realizing how much more you don't know. This might be a controversial phrase. You're doing it wrong. You can learn items, you can learn specific things, but your learning should always be opening up doors to things that you didn't know were possible and new places that you're going to learn about. Always be learning. There's a balance there. You don't have to do this obsessively, and you don't have to don't do it to the point where you're feeling like you're failing. But every time I figure out a problem, it never fails. I always find more problems that I don't know the answer to as a result of that, or the next step, or the next way to make it better. Embrace that. Always learn. I'm a fiend for learning things. So I think keeping that learning mindset is the best way to keep sharp and keep building that automation first mindset. So these are things that I think of as like the core, for me, for Cody, the core tenets of kind of building an automation first mindset. But there are like a couple of personality things that I tack onto this that are just kind of common things that Cody thinks about, and just the general like way I interact with the world. I try to lead with kindness. I talked about that earlier. I remember every admin, every person who took those chances on me and was very kind to me along the way. So I try to pay that forward. I think that the universe has a way of treating us right when we treat other people right. So it's just a good feeling. And I feel like I do a pretty good job at the leading with kindness part of this. But bringing people with you, that's another one. Again, I remember the people who took chances on me. There's a guy at the utility, or who was at the utility. His name's Mike Gall. He works at Microsoft now. He does field sales. I remember he sent the first email out that said, "Hey, Cody's a really good guy and we should give him a shot." And that was I talked about Python and Flask as turning points in my career. That was a turning point in my career, because this was a person who knew me very little. I did a couple of cool things for, and he went out on a limb for me, and doors opened because of that. And I've been fortunate enough in my career to have that happen with a number of people who were just really kind mentors who cared about it. And I try to do the same thing for other people. And so far it's worked out pretty well. So bring the people around you with you. Take chances on people. We live in a crazy world, and there's a lot of not great people out there, but I find that I'm not disappointed in people all that often. Like, there are a few cases where I am, but generally speaking, people show up. So bring people with you, help them get along. It'll repay you in your soul in the long run. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm doing these days as we're kind of cruising up towards the end of my block of time. What's my automation story these days? So these days I work at Kong. You'll see on the bottom of the screen before I click on the next screen a couple of the tools I'm working with these days. There's no advertisement in here, really. It's more just to give you guys a view into how my world's changed from the guy who wanted to pitch Nokia cell phones to trouble men in San Francisco, where I've ended up now. So these are just tools that I'm working with these days. So I work on Service Mesh. Without getting too deep into what Service Mesh is a way to connect applications, and it gives you some cool abilities on top of those applications and the way they talk between things. So Kuma is a Service Mesh developed by Kong. I personally feel like it's the best one, but I'm also biased, so I recognize that. It really focuses on, one of the things that attracted me to it is it focuses on connecting globally. So we have this idea of a global control plane, and you join different clusters, virtual machines, whether it's Kubernetes clusters, whether it's Docker hosts, whether it's a number of different systems. They all join this global control plane, and you interact with that control plane to do things. So if you want to roll out version 2 of an application in Amazon EKS, you deploy it, it joins a service mesh, you apply a policy that controls the amount of traffic going to either one of those. That's a more business style example. conversely, I could set it up on my system here in my house in Sacramento, connect to Michael, and wherever Michael lives in Europe somewhere, wherever Michael lives. And I could connect to his system. We could have a service mesh between us, and we could be passing traffic between our labs also. That's more of a fun, like, home labby thing to do. But I love service mesh because it really does adopt that creating scale concept. As an admin, I can be interacting with the traffic flows and the way these applications are orchestrated between a number of clusters. I can say I want 75% of traffic to be hitting my vSphere cluster and 25 going to Azure. I can do 20 going to Azure and 5 going to EKS and watch the flow of that traffic to see if there's problems between any of those. I can collect metrics around all of that and pull data out of all of that and see where the high latency points are. It's got a very flexible interaction model, which I really love. You know, I've been doing a lot inside of Kong has an API product called Insomnia. It's very similar to Postman. It's got some cooler features in certain aspects of it. But I've been doing a lot of API work against aspects of Kuma and Kong Mesh with that. So there's a lot of things I love about service mesh from a creating scale standpoint. My entire role is about driving visibility and adoption of service mesh. So I tend to focus a lot on that. I build some cool things and cool demos around that. We'll talk about that stuff another day. It's not meant to be an advertisement. It's just, what does Cody do at this time? In the more super hobby sort of way, I do a lot in, I've kind of moved on. I did a lot in Angular. Some of the people on the call I know have seen some of my Angular presentations and stuff on like Clarity UI and stuff like that. But as part of just maturing and growing my skills and trying to do new things, I moved in and doing a lot of stuff in React these days and learning how to write in React. So I've been working a lot about kind of refactoring my demo application that I have into a more React model, and trying to bump up some of my Python skills to kind of next level stuff. So I've been working a lot in that, building aspects of the demo app, tying it back into the Kuma mesh stuff that I talked about before. So this is the demo app I wrote that has a number of microservices behind it, a couple of databases that it hits, has live connectivity that shows what data center I'm hitting or what zone I'm hitting inside of Kuma, and it dynamically renders. There's some WebSocket stuff happening behind the scenes that I'm pretty proud of figuring out. But Python, in this case, and from an automation standpoint, there's so much automation happening behind the scenes that Python's responsible for in that. That's been just a massive learning for me. And I get a lot of reward from learning in that way. It's kind of that always be learning thing. So something I want to highlight from this slide, though, I spent a lot of time playing with this, and it's not my core job to do that. But you are not your job. I fell in for a number of years into this pattern of I need to be loving my job. I need to be living my job. You are not your job. You have the opportunity to go and play with technologies, play with automation, build things that is not part of your job, and you can get the same reward from that and feel accomplished from doing that. You are not your job. Take the opportunity to play and enjoy technology outside of the things you have to do for a paycheck between your normal working hours. I was a little preachy on that one, but this has been a big realization for me recently that I feel the need to harp on in the community a bit. Finally, this one is a recent one. I had an opportunity to play with a lot of stuff inside of Flux. I think it's a pretty cool platform. I had very little interaction with it long term. Weaveworks is the company that created it, and I'd played with several of their other tools, but I hadn't engaged much with Flux. But I did recently quite a bit, and I really kind of fell in love with the operating pattern of it, mostly because I'm going way back. People who hung out with me at VMware know I did a lot of enablement around getting started with GitHub and how to committing code, and so teaching people how to get started in that realm. So I'm pretty passionate about that. And I really love the model of kind of using Git as the source of truth for driving automation. I think that there's a ton of stuff that Git does. We tend to hyper focus on the code aspect of Git, and we say we store our code here. But ultimately, I think of Git a lot as a collaboration and interaction tool. So I think that what's really cool about Flux is that it uses those repositories and that GitHub model as a source for things that need to be done. And in the case of most of the things Flux does is driving, cluster creation for Kubernetes. So using cluster API to drive cluster build outs when you commit code in, driving application deployment. So a good example of this is I have a repo now where I deploy out a new cluster API manifest that will deploy out a Kubernetes cluster. it'll then use Flux and ultimately Flux uses Helm to go out and deploy Kuma onto it, deploy my CNI onto it. So I'll use like Cilium as a CNI, and it'll deploy onto there, and then I'll deploy my demo app. And if I want to change an aspect of my demo app, maybe I run that again and recommit my demo app code, and it'll go out and reconcile that constantly. Maybe I want to create a new branch and have a different interaction model for that branch. Maybe I want to add Robert to that and let him commit in. And when I approve in Git, it goes out and fires off those changes. I think that's really powerful model. And I think that GitOps model that we've talked about is ultimately a huge key component of the future of what we're all doing from an automation standpoint. I think that moving away from interacting directly on your desktop and moving to a place where you're committing this code in and that system is handling the interaction is kind of where we all should be looking to go. So food for thought on that. So this is the end. There's an end of file reference there, but I didn't think it would land, so I had to explain the joke, which really ruins the joke ultimately and leaves us all in a worse place than where we started. But here we are. I think a lot about kindness, right? We talked a lot about that, and I'm going to harp on it all the way to the end. You know, I think of I'm gonna plug a couple people here, like Michael and Robert and Mark are some of the kindest people I know. You know, I have stories about each one of these guys that really exemplify why these are kind people. I'm fortunate and proud to have been able to know these people. And I talked earlier about creating scale. These are the kind of people that made my world bigger, right? When I started at PG&E all those years ago, I would have never known that I have friends globally that I cared about in the way I care about these people, and that I'd have these kindness stories with people like that. Put people around you that make your world bigger. Put technologies around you that make your world bigger. Never settle for small. Always think about how these things make your world bigger. I thank you guys for making my world just a little bit bigger every day. Save the things you do, right? We build things in hacky ways. We have fun with the tech we do. Save it, you know, put it off to the side, commit that into somewhere, keep it local, keep it remote, hopefully, and use that to drive future conversations, future automation, future building. And that ties into the code everything aspect. I'm not going to harp on that too much. We talked about that a bit, but you know, I truly believe the more I learn, the more I find I don't know, and I am more than okay with that aspect. I'm totally good with knowing that I'm always going to be looking for more things to learn. So that's what I got for you guys today. I think I hit my time limit pretty well. Let's chat more. I loved this presentation. I hope you loved it too. Come find me on Twitter at Cody D. Arkland. I'm around. I'd love to talk to people. Add me, shoot me a DM. Let me know if you liked it. Let me know if you have any thoughts. Let's talk more. Talk soon. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you actually have 5 minutes more, so I don't know if there's any questions. And it always takes a couple of minutes. Yeah.
It's questions, comments, thoughts?
Comments. That was fantastic.
Hey, thanks, Tim. I would have included you in my nice little friendly shout out thing there, but I didn't know you're here. So
yeah, that's fair. That's the story of my life. No worries, man.
So if there's no questions, then Tim, I'm guessing you're on next. Are you ready?
Well, I guess I have to follow Cody. Apparently that's been in print for a while now. So yeah, let's do this.
He didn't do any demos, so easy one.
The day is yours, Tim. The day is yours.
I mean, in all fairness, I wasn't planning on doing demo either. I mean, I can, but all right. So can everybody see my share? Just checking.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to apologize in advance because I do have branded slides, but you can forget that. Excellent. I'm Tim Davis. I'm currently a DevOps advocate with a little infrastructure as code startup. I am currently the only US employee. Everybody else is based out of Tel Aviv, Israel. And we focus on infrastructure as code automation. Now, what we're going to be talking about today kind of ties into what I do, but really we're going to be talking about a lot of principles and kind of things that you should think of. A lot of people come to this session thinking, oh, great, he's going to give me a step-by-step guide on how to, you know, do infrastructure as code and automate it. And unfortunately, that's not the case. And the reason for that is the traditional engineering answer of it depends. There's a million different variables that come into a bunch of different decisions for this. Any architect or engineer will tell you, you can't just choose something and go with it. Well, you can, but it may not be best for you. You need to kind of take into account a whole bunch of things. What are you trying to accomplish? What kind of application are you trying to run, et cetera, to kind of bring this together. So just level setting, we are going to kind of help you kind of try to make some decisions, figure out some things. If you are new to infrastructure as code, all the better. If you are absolutely not new to infrastructure as code, maybe there's some things here that'll help that you haven't thought of yet. Otherwise, who knows? We'll see how it goes. So me, like I said, I'm currently a DevOps advocate. Really, if you boil that down, I tweet a lot for a living. I'm technical marketing. I focus on making sure that people not only know that we exist, but why we exist and how to utilize our product, creating content, speaking to awesome folks like you. Thank you for having me on for this. Everybody involved. I know Mark originally reached out to me. It does not look like he is on right now, unless I missed it somewhere. I would give him a lot of crap for that, but I will not do that because I know Kat's in charge and I don't want to have to answer to her for it. Before I was at M0 and everything, I was at VMware. That may be where, that's actually where I met and knew several of you here. I was part of the cloud and developer advocacy team working in our public cloud SaaS services. Before that, I was a pre-sale systems engineer for NSX. Before I came to VMware, I was with Dell as an enterprise architect focusing on VMware infrastructure and architecture. Before that, I was in infrastructure operations at SoftLayer. You can start to see the kind of trend here. I'm an infrastructure guy. That's, an infrastructure and systems is what I've been doing my entire career. Now I'm doing DevOps and I am doing developer advocacy. I am helping developers be successful. And I get the question a lot of, you're an infrastructure guy, how are you making developers be successful? And as soon as I figure out the answer to that question, I will be sure to let you know. But really, DevOps is exactly what it sounds like. It's dev and it's ops kind of coming together to make the business more agile, to speed up delivery. And there's a lot of organizations that just take developers and they make them start automating tasks. And that's all well and good. It's definitely a piece of it. But understanding infrastructure operations, how to bring these things together, how to deliver what you need to make the business successful faster. I'm kind of the ops side of DevOps. So I personally think you need a little bit of both to be successful with that. We have an agenda here. I'm absolutely not going to stick to it. I don't believe in practicing my, talks or anything like that. So we're just going to skip past that. A couple of key terms to talk about here: static environments and dynamic environments. A lot of us basically know what a static environment is. You've got your home lab, you've got your, development lab at work. You may have clouds these days where you can spin up what you need dynamically, but really, if you think about old school, labs, this is exactly what static environments are. They're built up. You have your full stack of your infrastructure. You have your app on there that you can play with and, do testing, but really it doesn't change very often. It's very long-lived. Dynamic environments are temporary, ephemeral type environments, real short-lived. You spin it up, you do what you need to do, and then you burn it down and you go on to the next one. Dynamic environments are really the way to kind of enable agility, enable speed. With static environments, there's a lot of different things that go into it. There may be problems that arise that kind of really slow everybody down for the development process. Dynamic environments can really help you speed that up and make sure that you're able to deliver what you need to a lot faster. So why dynamic environments? If anybody here has run a lab for a company before, the term who's on dev or who rebooted this or who did that is probably the bane of your existence, or used to be. I ran what was basically a production lab when I was at Dell. That thing could not be down for any purpose at any time, which really, that's not dev. Like, what's the point of that? That's just another production that you're testing things on. It's really a pain. If somebody needs to test a patch or to do something that can be a breaking change for somebody else, you have to coordinate that. So it kind of puts somebody on hold, or you spend a bunch of money and you have a bunch of different stacks and copies of the same thing. These days with public cloud, it really allows you to have multiple stacks, multiple copies, and kind of be a little more dynamic with the way that you do that. Dynamic environments also help you with fewer wasted cloud resources. Now, I know that kind of goes against what I just said of, you've got all of these different environments spun out at once. But if you think about it, with the static environments, you've got one giant stack out there. You may have multiple copies of the same stack. It's always out there. With dynamic, shorter lived ephemeral environments, you may have 5 things that are spun up at once, but those things are only going to be spun up for a short amount of time, just exactly what you need it for. You spin it up, you do your testing, you do your patching, you do what have you, and then you burn it down. So overall, that ends up saving you because you're only using what you need. You're not sitting there with either wasted resources at one time or overutilized resources at another. So it just kind of allows you to be a little more flexible with that. Everybody here has probably seen a copy of this slide. I have, in fact, presented copies of this slide for the past however many years it's been now. And it really bugs me, but the problem is I can't find anything good enough to replace it because it is a really good illustration of why dynamic environments are so important these days, why a lot of folks are going to that. With the old school monolithic, like 3-tier stack apps, you didn't really change a lot very often. You had your patches and things like that, but there wasn't a lot of moving parts. There wasn't a lot of, things that needed to be moved around. With newer cloud native microservice type architectures, there's a ton of different moving parts. You're shifting things, you're moving things in and out, you're updating these little pieces. And that's really, when you come to a static testing environment, that's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different pieces that could be trying to work at once. It could cause a lot of headaches. With dynamic environments, everybody can have their own little thing. You make your little switch and you're good to go. So it's kind of a really good illustration of why dynamic environments can be so important these days. Developers more and more are deploying infrastructure. Way back when I was a systems administrator, I would have told you that developers deploying infrastructure was awful. It was bad. They were going out and swiping their credit card, creating what we all called shadow IT, and just really causing problems for overall infrastructure delivery. But the reason they were doing this is simply because from an infrastructure perspective, we weren't delivering what they needed, how they needed it, and how fast they needed it. So it's just one of those things where way back when, if you were to look at the salary scale of a systems administrator versus an application developer, there was such a huge disparity. And that was because infrastructure, you had to deliver the infrastructure to run the app that runs the business, but overall the business saw more value in that application developer than they did in infrastructure. And that's just one of those things where you have to think about it from an infrastructure perspective of, if the business thinks they're more important, it's because whatever they're doing, they can directly correlate to a cost center. If that application is down for however long, you quantify that, and that's how much the business is losing. Of course, if the infrastructure goes down, it's the same thing, but you just kind of have to think and put yourself in the mindset of, why are they doing this? Why are they going out there and deploying more? And it absolutely makes sense. They speak in code. They need to go faster. They don't want to open up a ticket. They don't want to go into a UI and click around and build what they want. And that's really where the advent of the infrastructure as code model came from. Developers speak in code. They speak in API. They don't want to go around and, use ClickOps or whatever you want to call it and click and build stuff. They just want to create a package or a script, shoot it off, get what they want 30 seconds later, and, off to the races. Infrastructure as code these days, whether you're personally using it or not, it's huge. And it's not just infrastructure as code. There's an entire industry of X as code now. You've got infrastructure as code, security as code, policy as code. There's remediation as code. There are so many different blank as code models out there. And it's simply because developers are just finding ways around infrastructure folks to do what they need to do faster and, take care and be agile. So really jumping on board with this, figuring out how you can do this. If you're an infrastructure person or if you're a developer, infrastructure as code is definitely a way of helping you to speed up, be more agile, and do what you need to do. The very first choice that you need to make when it comes down to moving to infrastructure as code models and stuff like that is figuring out, what framework are you going to use? There are so many different frameworks out there. Obviously, Terraform is the #1 name in the game. And one of the big reasons for that is because they're cloud agnostic. Now, if you're 100% all in on AWS, you're probably either using CloudFormation, have used CloudFormation, or are looking into it. And it's great. It does exactly what you want it to for AWS. Same for ARM templates or Bicep or whatever they want to call it now in Azure. They are absolutely great for what you need to do. But if you at some point might be multi-cloud, if you are multi-cloud, I know that's kind of a hot button buzzword that people either use incorrectly, or there's some vendors out there that are within the past month saying multi-cloud doesn't exist. It's just a word that people use to sell you stuff. That's not true. In DevOps, in automation and things like that, you don't necessarily want to buy one monolithic suite of tools. You are piecemealing the best of breed of each little thing. You've got your developer duct tape and baling wire. You're putting it together and you're making it work the way you need it to. The same is with cloud. AWS is great for microservices. They have a tiny little service that does that one tiny little thing that you need, and there is tons of those services. If you are an all SQL shop or you're a Microsoft shop, you're going to be using Azure for stuff like Azure AD and other things. If you're using big data, if you're doing AI ML, GCP is great for that. It's just one of those things where each one of those clouds does their own thing better. So why not use all of those? Whether you are today or you might later, making the architectural choice now to choose a cloud agnostic framework may be better off for you. Your Terraforms, your Pulumis, using TerraGrunt. That'll just kind of allow you to have a little more flexibility and a little more agility down the road if you do need to migrate clouds or you do need to be multi-cloud or what have you. Now, of course, you can't just take Terraform AWS and deploy it out to GCP. The provider's a little different. The language is a little different. It is what it is. But it's going to be a little bit easier to refactor that than it will be just to completely take an ARM template and try to turn it into a CloudFormation template somehow. So that's definitely the first thing that you really need to kind of start thinking about with that. The actual process of moving to infrastructure as code. Are you going to start fresh? Are you going to re-platform? Are you going to re-architect? This is one of the biggest questions that I've seen. And I can name one customer specifically that just decided to start from scratch, refactor their entire application, and then build up their infrastructure as code from scratch. And that was just because they had an old archaic application. They were thinking about refreshing anyways. And when they started looking forward to how do we become more agile? How do we get into DevOps? How do we do this? They just went, well, we'll just push all of these things together. We'll start from scratch and we'll refactor and migrate and what have you. Most of the time, shops are looking to create infrastructure as code files based off of the deployments that they already have. So they'll say, we already have this application. It's deployed out into, GCP or Azure or AWS or, VMware or on-prem or what have you. We need to templatize this, create infrastructure as code files. For for GCP, and I believe a little bit of AWS, there's tools out there like Terraformer specifically that you can point at the cloud, you tell it which resources you're using, and it will write your infrastructure as code files based off what's already out there. The biggest thing is you need to get from where you're at now, which is either nothing or a bunch of resources, to a repeatable template file. And with infrastructure as code, that'll be your Terraform files or your TerraGrunt configs or what have you, so that you can then implement this in a repeatable fashion to start using it dynamically for dynamic environments. So once you figure out what framework you're going to use, then going through and figuring out what your strategy is for either starting fresh, creating those new files, writing it, or finding tools that will help you adopt the deployments you already have into new written infrastructure as code files. So looking at the process now with dynamic environments, you've got your developers that can develop on their local machines. They can do what they need to do. They can create a pull request. They can then do end-to-end testing on dedicated infrastructure. If they need to start over and blow it away and what have you, they can do that. If they need to implement breaking changes, they can do that, all without having to go through and then mess somebody else up or ask, hey, who's on dev? When can I do this? All of that is kind of dedicated so that they can be doing their own thing. The person next to them can be doing their own thing. And that's when it moves into kind of a shared model where you're then merging back to that main branch and then deploying out to production. So it kind of allows you a little more agility to do your own thing while still working collaboratively across the Git platforms or what have you inside of your repositories. So actually setting up the dynamic environments, we kind of talked about why dynamic environments are better over static environments, or how you can gain some benefit from that. We talked about choosing a framework. We talked about how you might start to build those infrastructure as code files. Then you need to start figuring out how to set up those dynamic environments specifically. The very first thing you got to do is just make sure that you've done all those previous steps and you have your template. You have those files set up in a repeatable manner. Now, I could talk for another hour on creating those files, writing them in such a way where you can templatize them. Using the programming mindset of dry or don't repeat yourself is important, because if you hard code all of your variable values and stuff into your infrastructure as code files, then it's going to be difficult to kind of templatize those and spin multiple ones out at once. Because if you try to do a Terraform apply, say, with that, then it's going to look out there. It's going to say, oh, this one's already deployed. I can't deploy another one because you did this. If you write them with variable values and you then during the deployment inject those specific variables, then you can say, this is my, PR 101 branch. This is 102, 103. It'll kind of allow you to have it where it is a repeatable deployment, not just a hard-coded single set of files. Figuring out your dynamic environment strategy. Are you going to do it on per pull request environments? So every specific pull request that may have multiple developers working on it. Are you going to do per developer environments so that each person gets their own for whatever task they're doing? Do you need to set up time to live so that if they forget that it exists and they move on to something else, it'll automatically burn that down? Making sure that the guardrails in your policy code is in place as well, so that if they are deploying out stuff, you can say, if this is an EKS cluster in AWS, they can only deploy out up to 3 or 4 or 5 nodes with that. You want to make sure that all of this stuff is in place and that you've made all of these choices before you kind of open up the floodgates and allow all of these environments to start getting deployed out. Otherwise, you will end up with a lot of cost spread and things like that. Implementing that deploy and destroy automation with this is really where you kind of open up the power of the dynamic environments while still keeping hold of what's deployed, who deployed that, where did they deploy it, what variables did they do it, how much is it costing me? That's kind of things that you have to keep track of when you are allowing for self-service automation and allowing all of these dynamic environments. This is normally where I would give a giant, pitch on M0 and all that. That is what we do, but really choose anything for environment automation. Lots of folks are already using CI/CD. These processes and procedures and tool sets are great for automation. If you're using Circle CI, there are orbs out there to help you deploy Terraform. If you're using GitLab, I know that they've got Terraform deployments built in natively. These tools can be great, but there are also specialized tools out there. We are one of them. A guy in the community named Eric Osterman, who, if you're not familiar with him in the Suite Ops office hours, he has an awesome Slack channel for Suite Ops, and he has weekly office hours where he will have people come in and talk about problems and tools and how certain things work. It's a really great community, and there was one time where he actually coined a term called tacos, which I absolutely love, and I use it a lot. It is Terraform automation and collaboration software. And really what this is it's a specific platform that is designed to manage the lifecycle of infrastructure's code deployments from deploy to destroy. We are one of them. Scalar, Terraform Cloud, and Spacelift are all part of this tacos subgenre of release automation and deployment automation. And all of us are hyper-focused on not just deployments, which from a CI/CD perspective, it's fine. It'll go through its tasks. It'll deploy out your infrastructure. It'll do what you need to do, but then it'll kind of wash its hands of it and walk away from that. Well, you really want to think of the other side of that life cycle of what happens when you're done with it. Does it get destroyed? Does it get redeployed? How does that work? With all of us in the tacos group, we're hyper-focused on that deployment as well as the destroy and the overall life cycle. So it really gives you a little bit of added feature of not only continuous deployment, but also some day 2+ operational things. It'll also allow you to help, from our perspective, help you kind of script in if you are using the Chef's, Puppet, or Ansible's, because just deploying the infrastructure is only a part of it. Once you do that, you need to configure your application, do what you need to do. So we'll allow you to kind of script that in, do what you need to do. We also allow you to script in things like security checks and stuff. So if you're deploying out all this infrastructure, you want to make sure that whatever you're deploying is secure or it fits inside of your governance. You don't necessarily want to deploy out an S3 bucket that's open to the public that you're going to put secure information in. Using tools like Chekhov from Bridgecrew or Terrascan from Accurix, that'll allow you to kind of go through, and once you've built the infrastructure as code files, when you do the init, you do the plan, which then goes through and builds what it's actually going to deploy. Before you actually do the apply and deploy that, you want to go through and check that plan and say, all right, what resources are we actually deploying? Are they secure? What's happening? What's going on? And it'll allow you to kind of go through and check and see, is this as secure as I need it to be? If so, you want to go through and deploy it. If it's not secure or something's wrong with it, you just want to cancel that deployment so that it's not actually deployed out there. Where to learn more? Forget those things. Follow me on Twitter. That is by far the best way to get a hold of me. That is any way that you want to get me. I've heard Kyle Ruddy say a million times, don't email me, I'm not going to answer it. Hit me on Twitter. And that's exactly what it's like for me. Feel free to ask any questions. I know this was kind of short, but as we all know, virtual is usually a little bit different. If we were in person, I would have singled y'all out, pointed at you, and made you answer a question and gone off on tangents. So, hopefully this was helpful for you. If you are interested in infrastructure as code automation, I'm contractually obligated to tell you that we do it better than Terraform Cloud. But really choose anything. CI/CD, if you've already got it, great. All of us Taco platforms can fit into a CI/CD process. We have, with our custom flows, the ability to not only be extensible via UI, we also have our API, we have our CLI, and we have a Terraform provider so that you can set up anything you need to do to manage those deployments in that lifecycle. But then we also have our custom flows, which allows us to script API calls outbound so that you can then go through and trigger out things like Ansible for configuration management, or if you want to put us inside of a Jenkins pipeline, that can trigger us for the deployment. We can send the API call back to say, hey, we're done. Here's your outputs, and you're good to go. Overall, it's just that whole process of find what you want to do, figure out what framework works, templatize it, and then set up that automation process. You just have to make sure that you're going through and figuring out all of the different things so that you can make sure you have the automation process that works best for you. And that's all I got. Any questions or anything like that? No?
It takes a minute or two for people to unmute their phones.
No worries.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one biggest thing I found about, presenting at the virtual stuff is like my 45 minutes worth of content takes, 20 minutes when you're doing it virtually because there's no, crowd participation and engagement generally.
Exactly.
Hopefully someday I can talk to y'all in person because sitting here yapping at my computer screen just doesn't cut it for me.
That said, we're kind of all got used to it now, right? So
I would love to say I've gotten used to it, but I sure haven't. I'm ready for it to be over.
That was helpful to me, Tim, because right now, yeah, I'm a virtual infrastructure guy, no coding whatsoever, right? I do. I'm starting off with PowerShell, or I started off with PowerShell. And just little things like that, where it's like, well, golly, this is going to take me how long? I'm like, no, how about I just spend a couple of hours and I'll Google it. And because, somebody has done it already. Exactly. And then I take their PowerShell thing and I save it to my Notepad++, and I reference it up top, and then I make my own little changes. And I'm like, yes, it is awesome. It feels so cool. And and that's how I'm getting started. But then this new position that I'm looking at, they use Terraform and
excellent
and Sentinel. Yeah, that's the thing. So yeah, I like the company. So I looked up what they do. I looked up the people, and I'm like, I want to do this, and that's what I'm learning. So yeah, and I think it was you that retweeted it, that you were going to present right after Cody today. So I was like, oh, cool.
Yeah,
I didn't even know
spot.
this group existed. Yeah. So yeah, no, great job. Yeah, thank you.
Very cool. I appreciate that. And if you're doing Terraform Cloud and Sentinel, obviously that means they're using, or if you're doing Terraform with Sentinel, that means obviously they're using Terraform Cloud. Sentinel is locked down to that platform. But that's policy as code. So for us, our customers use Open Policy Agent, which is essentially exactly what Sentinel is. It's very cool if you're going over that direction. Terraform is a fantastic product. I love Terraform simply because not only do they have a provider for every public cloud or private cloud you'd want on the planet, but you can also find providers for SaaS tools and even hardware. I know F5 has a Terraform provider that you can manipulate their hardware with Terraform, which is really cool. Definitely, if you're doing a little bit of PowerShell stuff, if you're doing a little bit of scripting, you're looking at going over to a company that does Terraform. I was sitting there the whole time Cody was talking, going, yes, this is great, do that. And like he mentioned, committing everything to Git. You have your Notepad++, that's great. If for some reason your computer gets on fire, that'll be gone. Take all of those scripts, check them into a private repository on GitHub. You won't regret it. And even if you don't, like, make it public. I've got some of the like jankiest scripts I've ever written in my life committed to public repositories on GitHub that have like 5 or 6 forks and like 10 or 15 stars. I'm like, who the heck is using this garbage? But sure enough, I mean, you never know who it can help. The whole point of all this is community. That's how I know a lot of the people here. That's how I got connected with, you know, speaking to y'all. So you never know what little thing you do could help somebody else. So, I mean, definitely get yourself a GitHub, start using that PowerShell, start looking into to Terraform and what you can do. It's going to be a whole new world for you, and best of luck with everything with that.
They're only stars, Tim, because we can't sad face them. Okay, like they haven't put sad faces in.
I know it's like there's
so
no downvoting.
It's like when someone says I broke my leg on Twitter and you do the love symbol. You don't actually love it. For some people I do, but we can't do a sad face for you. Frankie, you mentioned using Notepad++. Tim and I are going to get on a stream with you, and we're going to teach you how to use VS Code and up level you, because like, dude, we need to get you Notepad++. We need to get you away from that. I tend to support people doing what they want and going on their journey. I will not accept you doing actual things in Notepad++. You're better than that. Okay. Like,
and I will tell you right now, that is exactly true as a reformed Notepad++ user. Like, I lived by Notepad++. If I didn't write it down in there, it didn't exist because my ADD would go me and it would be gone. So my whole life was in a Notepad++ until I started using VS Code and Git. And now, I mean, I have repositories literally for just notes and stuff that has nothing to do with coding. So it's definitely helpful. And it's something that you should definitely look into for, you know, long-term sustainability.
Help us help you. Help us help you.
Exactly right.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I comment coming from the operational side of things. I actually remember the first time I got introduced to a Git repo, and that was actually Cody, because he did something, and I had a change to it. And I kind of wrote him and said, hey, you need to change this. And he was like, yeah, I wish we had this tool where we can just collaborate and you can just kind of get, I was like, whoa. So
let me introduce you to my friend, pull request.
Yeah, and he got me introduced to how you actually use Git. And from my point of view, it was really hard to learn. It was a different concept. And then a little bit of commercial here. On the automation user group page, we actually have a link to, under the trainings for, I think it's VMware Code, who did this practical Git. What's that? It is, if you're getting started with Git, it is hard. It is it's something people complain about. Look at Twitter. It's and it is a different concept, but it is so much worth it. So
there are people who have been developing and using Git for however long Git's been around that will still tell you Git is hard, and they're not even an expert. If you're just going in, and even if you're doing things like, you know, pull requests and opening issues and doing all this, you could still not even close to be scratching the surface of Git. So while it is difficult, being able to use it functionally for a normal person's perspective, it starts to click pretty fast and you can figure it out. Just don't get overwhelmed with, like, you know, having to do rebases and all this other stuff that if you're using it by yourself, you'll just never use.
I've been using Git for a couple of projects on customers for the last couple of years. I switched from infrastructure. That's where I actually met Robert back in the days. And the last 2.5 years, I've been spending about 90% of my time just PowerShelling the heck out of VRO, SRM and orchestration in general. And it turned out that Git was the link between 4 different countries across 4 different time zones, that we were able to collaborate in this huge repository. If we did not have Git, that would have been impossible to achieve. So for Frankie, learn Git. It's going to help your career going forward, because it's going to be the glue for your development going forward.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm one of the Seattle VMUG leaders, and I did have Patrick give a presentation on Viva, and then yeah, like when you sent me the presentation beforehand, I created an account, and then I was like, oh cool, I have it. And I was like, now what do I do? And I was like, oh, I don't have time to learn this. So yeah, now I'm circling back, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, now I can play with it. But yeah, okay, now that I've gotten beaten down to the ground, okay, no more Notepad++. I promise. Yeah, awesome. Yeah,
don't get me wrong, I still love Notepad++, but it's just one of those things where if for some reason something happens and you lose that, it's all gone. But in Git, it's not.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Oh yeah, and then the link that Cody dropped in there, the second one. Oh, that is nice.
That's that fire, bro. That's that fire.
Oh, dude, that is nice. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm gonna get me one of those. I'm gonna work on that this week. Yeah, that was funny.
Look at you with the web-based VS Code.
So if there's no more questions, then next up is Chip. So I don't know if you're ready.
Yes, he is ready.
That is perfect. Well, then take it away. And thanks, Tim, by the way.
Well, thank you to the AUG hosts for having me. I appreciate you having me on and sharing this, and also just want to take a moment to give a big +1 to what both Cody and Tim were talking about, not only in their respective sessions, which are absolutely completely relevant and valuable, but the immediate discussion as far as committing it to Git. I'll just tell you my own experiences. My blog that I have so many crappy and janky scripts that are there, and I just dump them all in one repo and say, you know what, blog scripts. So that's basically the web-based Notepad++ repo. So, you know, and what Tim was saying, even if you don't know how to rebase, even if you don't know how to do merges across branches and all that, stick it in one repo, call it important stuff, and then just commit it. And then by doing things like that, and by, you know, at some other point, you or others may want to work on it, you know, especially if you expose it. And this is why it's helpful to have public repositories, because inevitably somebody's going to run across it, whether you blog about it or not. And they're probably going to say, hey, man, I found this problem with it. Let me send you a PR. And then now you'll start to go through the process of these collaboration tools that are involved in it. And now that'll open up other doors for how you really use this in much more elaborate ways. Or if you don't end up using it in elaborate ways, you'll at least have a base competency that you can transfer to lots of other things as our world becomes more and more codified. Okay, so with that said, let me go ahead and start what I am here for. I have to share. All right, somebody give me a yeehaw that they can see this. All right. So my name is Chip Zoller, and today I'm going to be talking about Kubernetes automation in multi-tenant environments with this tool called Kyverno, which most of you probably haven't heard of. But before we get more into that, I just want to I want to pause for a quick second and invite some audience participation here. So audience, get your clickers ready. By a show of hands, and if you're next to your keyboard or if you're next to your phone, put up your hand if you work with Kubernetes on a daily basis, or if you would consider yourself a little bit more than have kicked the tires with Kubernetes. So put your hand up in the chat. I want to see how many people are familiar with this and how many people is this just completely foreign to, because that'll give me an idea of the amount of depth to go into and not assume so much prior knowledge. Okay. So really, 3 people out of 20 something folks. All right. Okay. Cool. All right. So we will go and talk about this from a little bit different level then. So just learning Kubernetes, great. This is for everybody. This is not for just those who are self-professed or maybe community professed experts. I'm certainly not. So anyhow, this is about Kubernetes automation in multi-tenant environments with a CNCF tool called Kyverno. But this is really, from a broader perspective, more about policy, which Tim and Cody have brought up at this point in time. And as hopefully you'll see is, obviously you probably know it's extremely important, but as you start get into Kubernetes more, and as you start getting to more environments, even if they aren't multi-cloud, they're infrastructure as code environments, and they're environments where there's more moving parts and there's more complexity, policy becomes critical to have. My name's Chip. I work for Dell Technologies. I am lead system architect for our Edge portfolio, where we're developing Edge solutions. This is not obviously a Dell presentation in any way, but that's what I work on. My background, I've spent many years as a consultant and also as an engineer for Fortune 500 companies, and working with Fortune 500 companies and building cloud management platforms, just building automation in general, no matter what it is. And more recently, in the past several years, sort of branched out and working with cloud native applications in various formats. So that's a little bit about that. I'm also a member of this Kyverno project that I'm talking about here, and I'm in that project, which is an open source CNCF project. I am trying to work on things that don't involve Golang. So a lot of this is documentation, helping folks in the community, trying to solve problems with it, trying to improve the experiences, and putting that feedback into the tool and improving that, and generally just making this, hopefully making it the sort of de facto standard, or at least the go-to for most folks that want to do policy in Kubernetes. And hopefully, as I would like to effectively show you, this really should be the first choice because of the benefits that it provides. I blog at a site called neonmirrors.net, and so that was the comment that I made earlier about just having a single repo for your blog scripts and just shoving everything in there. So whenever I write a blog, and I don't blog extensively, but the things that I do write about, they tend to be problems that no one solved, or that they're really esoteric and that no one's really cared to solve. I think this is a common theme throughout the community, but I just have a repo and I stick all of my blog scripts in there, and so just point my website at that, and that's been a great way for getting my work saved out there. And also, you know, at the end of the day, it's really about helping people. Although I kind of joke, but those that blog, I think a lot of the impetus for doing it is the situation where, hey, I put this thing down for 6 months and I come back to it and I have no idea what the hell I did. So I have to use a blog as a sort of a way to refresh myself because I run into those problems. So anyway, so that's a little bit about me. I don't like spending a lot of time talking about that. So I want to instead talk about multi-tenancy in Kubernetes, but backing up a bit and talking about multi-tenancy in general. You know, we're probably comfortable with the idea, or familiar at least with the idea of tenancy in its various forms, but just to sort of go back and to state the obvious, tenancy is a way of segregating workloads by some boundary. Could be many different boundaries. It could be your customer boundary. So your Coke versus Pepsi, those are two different customers. They have to be segregated. And the segregation is a multi-dimensional segregation. So performance segregation, security segregation, RBAC segregation. A lot of these different domains fall under the sort of the overall rubric of tenancy. It could be business unit, your HR department versus your finance department, for example. Even though that might be within the same customer, those are separate business units, and depending on what their needs are, those might need to be separate tenants. Or it could even be separate environments within the same company where there's no other forms of segregation, your dev versus your test versus your prod and whatever other designations you might have. But no matter how you define tenancy and how you slice and dice it, they really categorize into hard tenancy and a soft tenancy. So when we talk about hard multi-tenancy, this is the case where you really have hostile workloads, and it may not necessarily be literally one trying to battle the other one, like maybe Coke versus Pepsi is, but these are concepts where there is no shared anything. Everything is segregated. And in the world of Kubernetes, this is really best enabled through separate clusters. And once upon a time when Kubernetes was sort of up and coming, this was a really challenging thing because it was really painful to build Kubernetes clusters. We didn't have the tooling that we had today. We didn't have the processes that we had today. We didn't have the ecosystem that sprang up around it because of its eventual position. And so everyone's sort of rallying behind it. We didn't have a lot of these tools. Today we have Cluster API. We have everybody and their uncle has some sort of way of building a cluster where it's all infrastructure as code, and there's nothing that you need to point and click to, and there's no bash scripts that you have to cobble together. Hopefully you're not doing that. But because of that, it's become trivial to build those clusters. And so this is really the only way, or the best way, for handling this type of hard multi-tenancy. But the benefit that this additionally provides is it controls the blast radius. So if you do have a problem in your cluster, you're taking out whatever your definition of that tenant is. You're not taking out your entire company. Sometimes that still happens, especially for companies that maybe have been in the game for many years and they haven't transitioned to sort of other multi-tenant models. But that's the notion of hard multi-tenancy. And soft multi-tenancy is a sort of relaxed version of that, where you don't have these battling workloads, or these workloads where there's such strict segregation. And these are things like your developer A group and developer B group that can coexist on the same cluster. And Kubernetes has a construct internally called namespaces. And if you're not familiar with a namespace, it's effectively, think of sort of a resource pool. That's not exactly the same designation, but I get a sense that a lot of us here are probably vSphere administrators, or at least involved in the VMware community. It's not exactly a resource pool, but a resource pool you can think of as sort of a sub-construct within a cluster, where a cluster is a single entity. So in a Kubernetes namespace, we have this ability to segregate roles. A lot of different types of objects are considered to be namespace, where they exist in one namespace or another. And so in this presentation, I'm really talking about when you use Kubernetes, and whether this is you playing around with it or you're using it for an organization, how is it that you provide that multi-tenancy and do it in a way where the burden is not as high on you for creating these other things that have to follow along? I mean, think about standing up a vSphere environment for those that have done that. Maybe this is for a different customer if you were a consultant like I had done so many times, or maybe this is just internally. You've got to stand up the infrastructure. You've got to configure your vCenter environment. You've probably got to add some other things to it that didn't come out of the box. There's all these steps that you have to do. Whether you're doing that programmatically or whether you're doing that manually, these are all things that you have to do in order to get to that dial tone, which is a common phrase that's used. You got to get to that dial tone where you can start being productive with it, or somebody to whom you're going to hand it starts to be productive with it. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about multi-tenancy in Kubernetes. especially when it comes to soft multi-tenancy with namespaces. And this is where Kyverno can really help, in addition to being sort of an overall policy engine, which I'll talk about here in just a second, but in provisioning these namespaces so that you don't have to do any of that other stuff, and a bunch of other benefits that it has. So what is Kyverno? Most people probably haven't heard of this. So this is a new admission into the CNCF sandbox landscape. This is a policy engine, which is written specifically for Kubernetes. And you can think of policy, I mean, this is a common word and we all know it, but you can really think about it for guardrails for your cluster. Not only what you can and can't do, but how those things happen. And in the case of Kyverno, which has many other functionalities than just, hey, John wants to do this. Are we cool with it? Yes or no? It can do a lot of other things in addition to that, like, well, here's something that we're taking in. Let's change that in some way so that when we save it, it's a mutated view of whatever the original was. Or one of the main focuses of this is talking about how do we create all new objects. And so that's where the validation, mutation, and the generation abilities come in. So validation, I want to create this pod. This pod is using X. Do we allow it or not? That's a simple validation. It's a yes or no decision. Do we do this? Do we not do that? A mutation is when someone says, all right, I want to create this namespace, and these are the parameters of the namespace. You might have a policy that says, okay, that's fine, so we'll create it, but we're going to change it in some way transparently and in the background so that the representation that gets saved is somehow different from the representation that was submitted to us. So this is how validation works. And then lastly, the generation, which is unique to Kyverno. So there are some other policy engines that are out there, but they don't have this ability. And this is one of the great things that it has that's able to really convert this to an automation engine, which is why I'm talking to you, because I think that this is pertinent to the automation discussion, is the ability to create itself brand new resources that you didn't ask it to create. I mean, you did through a policy definition, but in order for you to get a namespace that's fully provisioned, it needs to go and do some other things for you. And this has the ability to do that in a codified experience. One of the other great things about this, and for those who might have used other policy engines, is there is no programming language to learn. I can't tell you how awesome that is, not to have to learn a bespoke programming language for the express and sole purpose of applying policy. And that's great if you want to do that, but I think you can agree that not learning a programming language is probably preferable to learning a programming language, especially when it comes to time to value. So there's no new language to learn. If you're comfortable with YAML, or maybe if you're not, so a lot of people may not be comfortable with it, you're not having to write a programming language. You're writing common language, and it's in a fully described schema. So just like other Kubernetes objects are written, that's exactly how you write about policy. And that in turn makes it easier to reason about policy, because you're not having to decipher a programming language or even a scripting language to figure out what this thing does. And I'll show you a really simple example of that. This operates as a webhook controller. So inside of Kubernetes, it has the ability to offer a set of extensions and a set of integrations by which these other pieces of software can register themselves with Kubernetes. And when it comes time at the appropriate point in the lifecycle, Kubernetes can call out to that other thing and say, hey, you wanted to listen for things about resource X, whatever that is. So I've got a resource X for you here. What do you want to do? And so Kubernetes just plugs into that webhook framework through both a validating and a mutating admission controller. And I sort of mentioned this earlier, but as a result of specifically the generation, but as you'll see, because I am going to do a demo, and hopefully it won't fall completely apart, but taking all of these three abilities, the ability to validate things, so yes or no, the ability to mutate things, is this good? How do we change it? And the ability to create all new things, combining them together is sort of like the Voltron of policy engines. Hopefully At least some people are familiar with that show. That was so awesome as a kid. I can't tell you. But this is what really transforms it into an automation engine rather than just a policy engine. You know, policy is critical, and we need to have it to provide those guardrails so that people can't do things that break your environment and put you in an exposed posture. But being able to level that up and be able to help you with your job and help you build things out and help you provision things in a way just increases the value of it. And I see it over and over again. So so it's super nice from that. And I touched on this as well, but yeah, this is policy as Kubernetes custom resources. So CRs for custom resources. So if you've written a pod before, if you've written a deployment, a service, all of these are native Kubernetes resources. And Kyverno policies are the exact same thing. They're a Kubernetes resource, except there's no language that you have to write in order to do that. And the nice thing about them is they can either be scoped to the entirety of your cluster, or they can be scoped to a specific namespace. So this further gives you more ability when it comes to the multi-tenant solution. So you as a cluster administrator might have a policy that says everything in the entire cluster must be able to do this, but delegate to one namespace, and maybe you give that to a set of developers or a set of operations folks, or maybe that's an ISV's application, and you say, this policy is only going to apply to the confines of that namespace, and everybody outside of that can do their own thing, as long as it is okay with the cluster policy. And then lastly, if you're familiar with pod security policies, in Kubernetes, you might know that they're very similar to what Kyverno provides, except Kyverno goes way, way, way deeper. PSPs are now deprecated officially starting in the current version of 1.21, and they will eventually be removed. And so if you're using them, you might want to give Kyverno a look, because unlike PSPs, where it was sort of a breaking change, you flipped it on and your cluster broke because you didn't have things associated correctly, Kyverno doesn't work that way. So you can try it side by side and either replace it with Kyverno or just kick the tires and see how well it works. So that's a little bit about Kyverno. And although I am saving a little bit of time at the end for questions, and I think we'll have probably a little bit more time than that, please feel free to stop me if maybe I glossed over something, I didn't do a good job of explaining it, so give me another shot at that, or if you just want to talk about some of these concepts a little bit more. Okay, so what does a policy look like? Well, here's a great example of a simple Kyverno policy. So this might be familiar to you. This is your standard run-of-the-mill YAML, and we're defining a cluster policy. And in Kyverno terms, this means that this policy is going to apply to the entire cluster. And if you just take a look at it real quick, I'm willing to bet that even though you might have never seen or used this tool before, if you take a look at this policy definition, you can probably tell what this does. And that's one of the great things about not having to write a language, because you can then reason about things that you've written and that other people have written, and you're just taking a look at. But we'll just walk through it real quick. We're saying here, first of all, inside of the spec, well, obviously we've got the yield metadata.name, you require labels. So we're going to require some labels. And validation failure action. What's going to happen if something gets submitted that's the subject of this policy, which does not make the validation? We're going to enforce it. That means that it's going to get blocked from being created. So we got a number of rules, and there's only one rule here, just to be simple. It's called check for labels. We're going to check for some labels. And what are we going to check it on? We're going to check it on a pod. So we're matching a resource, and we're looking at all pods that are coming into the cluster. We're going to check them for labels. So if we go down here to the validate, this is the type of policy that we're writing. So I showed earlier that Kyverno can do validation, mutation, and generation. We're only looking at validation here. So this is just a yes or no. This is are we going to create it? Are we not going to create it? And the message is what we're going to return to a user or to a process if the validation fails. And we're just going to simply say the label app.kubernetes.io/name is required. Fairly simple. And then we get down to the actual validation, as in what is being validated. And we see that we have a pattern statement here, and this pattern is referencing the precise location in the schema for a pod, because that's the source of the policy of what's being validated. And we're looking at metadata labels, and we're looking for a label called app.kubernetes.io name, and it has to be something. So there's got to be something in that label. So the net effect of this is, hey, John wants to create a pod, and it does not have the label app.kubernetes.io/name with some value. We're going to block it, and we're going to tell him, nope, the label, etc., is required. Very simple, very straightforward. And so with that, I'm going to flip over and do a demo so that you can actually see the combination of this in action. But before I do that, are there any questions before I start typing on the keyboard? Otherwise, stop me in the process and we'll take a look. Okay. So let's go, and we're going to start from the beginning. Not like of the presentation, but we're going to start with my favorite editor, and I get a sense most everybody else's too, VS Code. The fact that this is free is amazing. And I am using it on my system. I've got a Windows 10 system, so I'm using VS Code with WSL2, and I am going to start by creating a new cluster. Even though I've got this pointed at a TKG cluster right now that's in my lab that runs in a separate vSphere infrastructure, I'm just going to create a basic cluster in Kind. And for those not familiar with Kind, this is a great way to get started with Kubernetes on your own desktop. This stands for Kubernetes in Docker. And by a simple command here, I'm just going to create a one node Kubernetes cluster just so we can start off completely fresh. And I realized that I did not show what I'm actually going to show in the demo, which I am going to stop and go back over and actually share that, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to really understand the point of this. So my mistake on that. So let's go back and show what we're actually, the point of this presentation is to show really how this works at the end of the day and why it's particularly useful. So what I'm going to do here is a end-to-end demo of showing how Kyverno can help by creating and provisioning those namespaces for you in a multi-tenant environment. So what we've got here is we're going to create a namespace, and a namespace is that soft multi-tenancy concept that I mentioned. And this is just a small snippet of what that namespace is going to look like. It's going to have a bunch of labels on it. And the idea is that the labels trigger the behavior that we want to have happen. And based upon the automation engine inside of Kyverno, the labels and their values are going to trigger certain paths in the workflow that are going to combine all of these functions of validation, mutation, and generation, so that at the end of the day, if the right person submits the right namespace with the right labels attached, and all of this is definable by you, then they're going to have a fully created namespace, fully provisioned, and a bunch of these other objects that are inside of it, which we'll see. So we'll take a look at it here. I'm going to create a namespace and give it whatever name, and it's going to have a bunch of labels on here. I've got one called business unit, network zone, data classification, and environment. The idea is that typically in a Kubernetes environment, we use things like labels and annotations, collectively different forms of metadata to either provide descriptive information about what that thing is, what it does, and also to be able to trigger behavior from internal or external forces. And so we're doing all of those things here. So for example, if we're creating a namespace and we have in our environment business units, maybe we've got a business unit called ecom for e-commerce. Well, we want to be able to inform our cluster administrators, hey, what's this namespace for? I don't know. Let's look at the labels. Oh, or the labels. Oh, this is an e-commerce namespace. Okay. Well, what network zone do we have that may trigger some other behavior? Okay, this is in DMZ, so on and so forth. So this is going to get submitted to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is going to then call out to Kyverno, and it's going to check and see if two things are there. It's going to look for a label called business unit, and it's also going to find out who is creating this, who is sending me this request, because we only want to enable our automation workflow if it comes from a cluster administrator or if it comes from a service account, which maybe we're using in our CI/CD pipeline to not only provision a cluster, but also, or build a cluster, but also fully provision it. So we want to provide some guardrails as far as who can do this thing and what can they do it with. Now, Kubernetes RBAC is able to do things somewhat of this nature. And as you'll see in the demo, I'm going to tell Kubernetes RBAC that I, Chip, have the ability to create a namespace, but Kyverno, through a policy definition that it has that's baked into all of this, is going to say, nope, you can't do that. So, anyhow, it's going to look at this and find out who's this and what's the contents of that namespace. If it doesn't come from the one that we expect, and if it doesn't have that label, it's just going to block it and it's going to fail creating it outright. But if it does exist and if it's from the correct cluster role, then it is going to create the namespace. After that point, it's going to look further down into it and it's going to find out, okay, what are some other things based upon the policy that we've decided? And I have one policy file, and I'll show it to you in just a second, with a whole bunch of rules that are involved. And each of those rules controls this decision flow. So we're going to do things like create a resource quota. If you're not familiar with resource quota, it's simply just saying, for the things in this namespace, what can you consume as far as CPU and memory? And it can be some other things, but we want to be able to put some controls on not letting people run wild and consume 80% of the resources on this cluster, because again, we're talking about soft multi-tenancy, so this is a shared environment. If the business unit equals one of those values, we're going to do something else. We're going to generate, and you can see from the key down here, green is the mutation and the blue is the generation. We're going to create a role binding. So that means that we're going to take a user or a service account, and we're going to pair that with a set of permissions so that people can begin to access it. Because after all, at the end of the day, if you provision a namespace, you need people or processes to use that namespace. It does you no good if you've just locked it down completely and nobody or nothing can use it. So we've got to generate a role binding so that things can get in there and start using it. If this is a PCI environment, which we signify with data classification label, we're going to modify that namespace name. We're going to put -PCI behind it so that we know very clearly when we look at all of our namespaces, this one is under PCI compliance. We're also going to create a new deployment. So this is a Kubernetes resource that wraps pods, and those pods have containers. And maybe this is something that runs some sort of introspection tool or whatever the case is. We're going to create a deployment. We're also going to create a network policy. So think of this as a set of firewall rules. That's kind of a bad example. It's really more sort of routing decisions as far as what pods can talk to which other pods, but we're going to create that on the fly based upon our policy definition, because we need to ensure that things that are in PCI don't just talk open to the world. And lastly, if the network zone is DMZ, so we're in a DMZ zone now, we're going to do some additional things to it. Now we're going to annotate the namespace. So we maybe for this one, anything that's in the DMZ, we need to make sure that we have protected. So we might be using something like Kasten or Valero or whatnot to back up this namespace. But we want to do this programmatically so we don't have to go and assign these labels and these annotations every single time. So we can just tell Kyverno, annotate the namespace if we know that this is in a DMZ zone. Maybe we're going to add another label for monitoring. That's going to get picked up by another tool which watches all of the namespaces in the cluster, and if it finds that, it's going to say, all right, that needs to be monitored. Now inject this monitoring tool, or at least start monitoring this in our external tool. And we might generate a second network policy to further control some things that are there. So this looks fairly complex, but as you can see, this combines all three of those abilities. And at the end of the day, the result is creating a namespace by you, whether that's a human or another process. At the end of the pipeline, the namespace is fully provisioned based on your exact specifications, completely ready to use. So any questions about what I'm hopefully going to show here before flipping back over and start to show it? All right. Let's go back over. All right, so when we left off, I created a kind cluster, and you can see here, I have my context set to it. So let's get nodes, and we've just got a single node here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is install Kyverno, and I've pre-saved this command up here. This is available through Helm, and I've already updated my repo, so I'm just going to do Helm install Kyverno, and we're going to put it in some namespace. So let's just let this run real quick, and it will pull that package down, the latest version. And you can see here that it's gone a little bit further and has already set up some default profiles for you. So I talked about PSPs being deprecated earlier. Well, upstream in Kubernetes SIG, they've identified a set of replacement guidances, or a set of best practices when it comes to what you should have set when it comes to pod security in your cluster. These are decoupled from the physical instantiation like pod security policies. These are things like guidelines, like pods shouldn't run with host path, or they shouldn't use extra security context. So what's happened in Kyverno is if we use the alias called cpol to get cluster policies, Kyverno has already installed these for you by default, at least the default profile, not the restricted profile, which contains even more. Now you notice that these are all in audit mode, which means that if you installed Kyverno, you're going to get all of these policies, but they are not going to block anything that comes in. They're just going to report on it. So this is a great way where you can get started with it and see in your cluster who's doing things, or what pieces of software are doing things that really may not be such a good idea. Obviously, there are lots of exceptions, and many tools need to run with some of these capabilities, but a lot of the ones that are in the user spaces don't need to run with these capabilities. So like I mentioned, host path, the ability for a container to poke a hole through to the Kubernetes node and be able to see its file system. You don't really want to enable that in a lot of cases. So this policy will, again, in audit mode, just simply report about, hey, Susan's application that's running out there, she's mounting /var/lib. Do you really want to do that? Probably not in a lot of cases. But anyhow, these are created out of the box for you, and there's nothing else that we need to do. So with that, the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to create some additional roles and role bindings for Kyverno, because by default, Kyverno does have the permission to generate a bunch of resources, but it as a matter of security best practices, things like roles and role bindings, it doesn't have the ability to do, just so that it, we don't get into an escalation of privilege scenario. So I am going to update it to do that. And I'm not going to walk through all of these things and drain this entire manifest, but we're going to create a role so that it can create deployments. We're going to bind that role to the service account that Kyverno uses. And I've put comments up here so that this is fairly straightforward, but we're also going to give it the ability that we're going to bind it to the ability to view. And we're also going to give it those abilities to create things like role bindings and cluster role bindings. And this is in turn going to enable our full workflow end to end. So the point being here is that the batteries that come out of the box are good enough for enabling a bunch of this functionality, but I'm sort of taking it to the nth degree as far as what you could do with it, and all of the things that you could sort of lump together in one go and have it generate. And so because of that, we're gonna elevate it just a little bit. So I'm gonna create that. So I've got to replace it. So I've done that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is create the giant policy that has all of the Kyverno rules in it that are going to enable all of this. And I'm not going to walk through all of this. I actually have a blog article that I covered with this exact same use case. And so, and I provide the link to it at the end. So if I'm going too fast, or if a lot of these concepts don't make sense, or maybe I just did a poor job of explaining it, you can take a look at not only the diagram, not only the use case, but this full manifest. And so you can walk through it and it's commented so that you know exactly what it's trying to do. I'm just going to cover a couple of them here. So the first one here, we're going to look at a validation rule. So we're going to validate just like the sample policy that I showed earlier, but we're going to validate the namespace because this is all about creating and provisioning namespaces. And I'm going to, excuse me, check and make sure that the business unit label is set by the authorized roles. So down in the metadata field, I'm going to look for something called business unit. And the only way that it can be provided is if it comes from a service account that we expect, or if it comes from a cluster role we expect. And there's some other validation that takes place of some other labels, because similarly, we don't want people to be able to create namespaces that fly under the radar and they're able to be in the DMZ. So there's other things that we're doing from a validation perspective. And then we're getting into some of the generation. So this one is going to generate that default resource quota when business unit does exist. So again, not going to walk through all of this, but pretty simply, as you can see, just with the validate rule, this is the entirety of the generate rule. There is no code to any of this, and we're able to generate a resource quota from this. So we're basically just saying, you know, in this block, let's just make sure that it's not empty. So we got to make sure that there's something there. Now, assuming that there is something in the business unit label, we are going to create a resource quota. Now, a resource quota is a namespaced object, which means it exists in one namespace or another. It's not a cluster scoped object. So we need to know where we're going to put it. Well, Kyverno is able to look at the request for the new namespace and say, put this thing wherever that namespace is going to go. And we're also going to synchronize it. I'll get back to that in just a second. And this is the content of that resource quota. So we simply just tell it the kind of object that we want it to generate. And we don't need to provide the entire manifest. We just provide the interesting part about it, because it's able to understand, all right, resource quota. So I know what this structure looks like, and I know, how to go about doing that. What I need to know is the spec, the stuff that's in the spec. So we are going to have a hard requirement for 6 cores of CPU and 12 gigabytes of memory. Now, the synchronized means that resource quota gets put in that namespace, but maybe we need to make some adjustments to that resource quota in the future. So how are we going to do that? Well, the nice thing about this is we can just go and update the policy. And if you're storing policy as code, which Kyverno works perfectly well in a GitOps type fashion, where all of these policies, again, sort of going back to the discussion we had about storing things in Git, you can store this entire policy definition in Git, and you can go into Git and change that from 6 to 7, save it. And when that gets pulled in, Kyverno will go and synchronize whatever that definition is, and any downstream resource quotas, because we're talking about resource quotas here, they're now going to say 6 and 12 without you having to go to each and every one or loop through them with some sort of script or use some other method to do that. It'll do that automatically. Okay. So I'm going to stop there as far as looking through this manifest. There's a lot here. There are a number of rules, and we're just going to go ahead and create it. All right, so cool. We've created the one cluster policy that contains all of our rules. So now let's test this, and let's make sure that the behavior of it is what we expect to do. So this isn't part of the policy. I'm going to show an unauthorized user, and I'm going to create a cluster role here, which just gives somebody the ability to create a namespace. I'm going to bind that to a new user, which Kubernetes has no knowledge of users other than what you say is the name in it. So you'll see that in just a second. I'm just going to call it myself, and I'm going to link those two together. So the cluster role, the permissions, what it can do with what, and the subject. And those are going to be bound together with this cluster role binding. So let's go ahead and create that. All right, so we've got those things. Now let's go and try and create a namespace. And I've got that simple namespace definition, extremely simple, like I showed on the demo diagram. And we've got our name, and we've got a number of labels that are attached to that. So let's see what happens if we try and create this as Chip, who, although he has permissions inside of Kubernetes, let's see what happens here. So I'm going to create. It says, nope, not happening. Blocked due to the following policies. And there are a number of policies that have come back and said, only role equals cluster admin and our service account can set the label business unit. And we've also got a similar policy that says you also can't set data classification or network zone. So we've just used an admission controller to augment Kubernetes RBAC by more finely controlling what it can and can't do. So let's see if we can do that now as not Chip. I am a cluster admin, so this should pass the policy definition. So let's try and do that one more time. So the simple return message was, cool, we created it. But notice how we started with GenStore app, we got GenStore app -PCI. So Kyverno not only validated this because it let us create it, that's the message from Kyverno or Kubernetes saying, we're good, we created it. And also the name just got modified to add -PCI. So let's go and make sure that all of the things that we wanted it to create, it actually created. So I'm going to go and look at my new namespace. So I need to, no, that's it. Let's get deployments. And we see all of these new things that just got created automatically as a result of me creating one super simple namespace with a policy. So we got a deployment called test deploy. We have our default resource quota. And we have two network policies, a basic network policy and a DMZ network policy. And let's also take a look at this namespace and see how it got modified, because we saw that the name got changed. According to our policy, a couple of other things should have happened as well. Okay, so we have a new annotation that didn't exist up here. So we see the labels, and these labels reflected down here, but in addition, we have that backup label called true, so that whatever system watches in our cluster and responds to these annotations, it's going to kick off and do its thing automatically. And in addition, we also got a new label called monitor true, which we didn't have up here. And otherwise, everything else is as it was. So as you can see, we got a bunch of additional things that Kubernetes would never give you out of the box. And we got them using policy defined as code. And in this case, it wasn't stored in Git, but it could very, very well have been stored in Git. And any subsequent changes that happen in upstream could be pulled in and automatically run by Kyverno and applied to the cluster. Any questions on what I showed with this demo? All right. Let me flip back over and just finish this up. So that's the workflow. And hopefully you can see that the power that this enables is pretty hefty. I mean, the ability to validate things, and not just pods, but anything that's in a Kubernetes cluster, whether that's a service or whether that's, you know, an Istio configuration, or whether that's a Bolero policy or whatever, you know, it could be pizza if you define that as a custom resource definition. Kyverno has the ability to check all of that. But in addition, it can also mutate all of those things. And it can take it a step further by generating those things as well to your specifications. And there's a whole lot more. This really isn't designed to be, you know, what is the tool and here's everything. There's a lot more that you can do with it. But hopefully this makes sense in the context of not only sort of an introduction to what the tool is, what it really can do, and how in an automation framework, and especially in a multi-tenanted environment, how this can really, really save you a lot of time reduce human error, and increase repeatability. And to just wrap up, if you want to know a little bit more about this, Kyverno.io is the website. We've got an extensive sample policy library. It's the largest of any policy engine out there. There's over 50, and it continues to grow with community involvement. So there's the URL for that. It's a really open community, very helpful folks, very nice folks. You can check them out at hashtag Kyverno on Kubernetes Slack. And lastly, just a few blogs that I've written on this tool. Starting with the first one there, this is a good introductory. It's a 3-part series where I break down each of those functionalities into a separate article, which is easy to follow with your own manifest that you can try out. And then the second one there is some production use cases that I've seen that have been somewhat of the sort of the bread and butter for people who really found like transformative changes in their environment. Things like being able to sync secrets and this whole namespace provisioner and being able to padlock resources. And then lastly, for those that might be familiar with OPA Gatekeeper, there's an article there that I try and post a fair and honest comparison between the two, their pros, their cons. And at the end of the day, use whichever one you feel like satisfies your goals and works best for you and your environment. But do look at getting some sort of policy engine. If that's not Kyverno, if that's not Gatekeeper, get something, put it in there. And thank you all very much. I will take any questions that you might have. And if there are no questions, thank you. Feel free to grab me on the Twitters at @ShipZoller. And if you're interested in my blog, neonmirrors.net.
I'm going to throw you a layup, Chip. Layup question.
Yes, sir.
So we obviously we connected ages ago from like an infrastructure background, and part of my talked a little bit about just like you never know where you're going to end up, and the idea of just the way things change. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how you ended up kind of in this space now? Like you're doing a presentation here around pretty I wouldn't say like super advanced, like it's good content about Kyverno. And like those policies are more advanced topics within the Kubernetes community. So it's just such a drastic departure from what like your initial identity to me when I first met you was. Just like mine has changed since back then. So like I'm interested to hear a little bit about how you ended up like growing into this type of a space, and how this like piqued your interest and ended up being something you dove in on.
Yeah, that's a cool question. So my background, I really sort of cut my teeth in the VMware space, and this was before I became a consultant. So I was traditionally an operations person, always dabbled in code and scripting, but never identified as a professional or full-time developer. And so, as I begin to get more and more entrenched in VMware software, and not just VMware, but a lot of other things as well, and also hardware infrastructure, the next sort of evolution of that is, cloud and companies being able to operate as a service provider. And that means that IT has to transform the way that they're doing things in order to be a broker of services. And the only way that you can do that is with automation. Everything, it's sort of table stakes at this point, but all of these things are enabled via automation. It doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter what it does, but these companies are trying to get to that point in time where they're trying to transform their operations, and rather than just, Excel ops or doing everything via email and things breaking, all of this is predicated on automation. And as you start building more and more automation, and whether that's with PowerShell, whether that's with VRO, whether that's with Terraform, all of these capable tools, you begin to see a pattern emerge as far as how you conceptualize your life and how you conceptualize things. And you begin to think less about getting this one little task done, but you begin to think about now a couple steps ahead. If I do this one thing, what's going to happen downstream of it? What's going to happen upstream of it? And then as you continue to go through that process and build these things that you click a button or the proverbial button, whatever form that may take, and all of this stuff fires off, then you begin to think about higher level constructs like, why did I just do this? What value is there in me doing this? Does this save me an hour once a year? Is this valuable to the business? How is the business making money or saving money based on this? And so you begin to question, why am I doing this automation to begin with? And you really think about the value chain, about why is this activity particularly valuable and what can we do with it? And then, that sort of transitions into the cloud native space where a lot of companies are looking to move even faster, to fail faster, to be able to make this giant feedback loop. And so I got involved in that not too early on, but containerization was the benefits were it's writing on the wall. There's apparent that there's just no way that you can be as agile and you can move as fast and safely and reduce risk and roll out features as when you're doing containers. And so I wanted to get involved in that space, and I wanted to weave that into this overall theme of automation. But just like every new technology, that brings its own set of challenges. And I think it was Tim that had a good slide about, here's what the architecture looked like in the past, and here's what it looks like now. And this thing is blown up with all these other pictograms and lines, and there's a lot of complexity. And so you have to think about now, all right, all of these things that I now have on my plate that I never had years ago, I still have to do the same things that I did in the past. I've got to secure them, got to be able to guarantee performance, got to have observability. I've got to, I have to answer all of these questions. It doesn't mean that these problems go away. It means, if anything, they're exacerbated. And so, I got more and more involved in Kubernetes, and I sort of took these problems on and figured out how to solve them for myself, and learned a lot in the process about myself and what I knew and what I thought I knew, and also what I didn't know. And so, as I started to solve more and more customer problems and my own problems, because I think one of the best ways that you can really learn about something is not only do it, yes, do that, but find a problem that you genuinely don't know how to solve. Find something that scares you and try and tackle it, or adopt someone else's problem as your own, and go about the process of trying to solve it. And in the process of trying to solve these complex problems, I realized, policy is pretty important. I've got to be able to, this is great when you're running Minikube and everybody's, YOLO and Minikube and kind out there. And that's awesome for beginners, but that's not going to fly in a business environment. That's not going to fly when you have hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, and your job is on the line and other things. So we all of these things that we as operations and infrastructure folks that we had to deal with, that like these were table stakes features. Like, yeah, of course you got to backup data. What are you talking about? Of course you got to secure things. You can't just let vCenter be open to the world. You got to solve them in new ways. And so that means bringing in new tools and new concepts and ideas. And so as I started to solve those problems, I realized that we've got to have a policy tool. And I started going about looking at those, and Kyverno was it's still a young tool. It's in the sandbox, but I really got behind this thing and thought, this is the right way to do policy. My company makes money for a living, and I have other things to do. I can't spend it learning a new programming language only to write policy. I just can't. So that's how I got involved with this. That's a long-winded way. And I think this is the right way to do policy, at least at the outset. And if you have other problems, those problems you can tackle them at the time. But that's a little bit about me and my journey and how I landed at this. And why I like talking about this, because I can really see the problems that this solves, and they did solve for me and for a lot of organizations. And it's just fun to work with. So thank you for the question, Cody.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. I think passing comment before I let other people ask questions. I think that, I come from a time when policy was boring and when I wasn't excited to work on it at all. And I've learned that ultimately, like, policy is a thing that drives how this stuff operates inside of environments. And policy is as simple as if something is allowed or denied, and as complex as how does something traverse an environment end to end, right? Policy is actually what's going to power this stuff in the enterprise, and it's wicked interesting when you embrace it. So I love the talk, man. It was great. It was great content. So
Thank you.
That's from someone who works in OPA all the time. So I appreciate the content.
I did see a question here from Lewis. I'm sort of scrolling back up, and I don't think I caught any other questions, but I'll just read the one out from Lewis, and hopefully I can give you an answer. So the question was, how do you handle policy adherence / violation workflows? Do you send webhooks out to seam tools when someone tries to breach policy, or don't you bother? Well, there are many ways to skin this cat, but one of the nice things about Kyverno is that policy violations show up as their own custom resource object. And so you get a policy report about the rules that were violated and when and by what and all of that. And so using Prometheus metrics if you want, and there's actually a project underway right now to expose a lot of these metrics as far as violations and everything else as Prometheus metrics. You can have Prometheus scrape that and either display it in Grafana and alert on it, or whatever tool that you want. It's all visible in a custom resource that's in the cluster. So if you don't want your policies in enforce mode and blocking things, and you just want to have a look-see as far as what's going on, put them in audit mode, check the custom resources, or use whatever tooling that you want. It's not opinionated about how you go about doing that. All right, with that, thank you, everybody. Thanks for Automation User Group. Thank you guys for having me. I hope this was helpful and useful. And if it was, glad to hear about it. If it was total crap, I want to hear about that more. So feel free to hit me up. Either way you can get me, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you very much. I have to say you lost me in a couple of places, but yeah. I'm still learning, but thank you very much. Right. I don't know if anyone wants to take a small comfort break before we start, or whether everyone's just eager and ready to move into the next session. Nobody said anything. Good. Right. So I didn't give you long. You got to jump at these chances. Okay. So our final speakers for the evening, we have Nico Vibert and Patrick Kremer. Patrick, you VMware as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Yep. We're both VMware.
Yep. Oh, well, there we go. I can see your top now. So they're both from VMware, and I believe they're going to be talking about how to get started with developing.
Yeah. Start coding today. That's our session. Hey, everybody. Patrick Kremer. I'm a staff solution architect for VMware. I'm dedicated to VMware Cloud on AWS. I'm here with Nico. Nico, you want to intro yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Nico. I'm a principal cloud architect at VMware, also looking after VMware Cloud on AWS. I'm based in the UK. And my background isn't really VMware. I ended up at VMware a bit by accident, but my background is networking. I came in about 5 years ago. I did an SX for a couple of years before switching across to VMC. And yeah, excited to be here with you all tonight.
All right, we're going to get going. So I dropped the repo that we're working off of into the chat. So, that repo is out there. You'll be able to use it, look at all the code. All the code that we're working with today is all out in that repo. I was particularly excited to see Frankie join the session, not to call you out, but you are the people that this is targeted for. I was that person, the sysadmin, just sort of trying to branch out into any sort of code not that long ago. So this is really kind of designed for people who are starting off. We are actually going to put you all in a live VM, an actual virtual machine with all the tooling installed, so you can actually play around with this stuff. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I'm going to show you the content that we've developed, and you're actually going to execute the code yourself. And if we get to it, you may even write some code yourself today. So hit the ground running. We're going to talk a little bit about APIs. We're going to talk about Power CLI, which is a PowerShell module. We're going to talk about directly running a raw API with curl. We're going to show you Terraform, and then we're actually going to invoke REST APIs. So we are, we work for VMware. So of course it's a VMware centric session because those are the resources that we have. We are going to be targeting a VMware Cloud on AWS vCenter. So it's running up in Amazon, and we'll just jump right into it. So this is really for anybody who has never coded or hasn't really, had the motivation to start, or it feels overwhelming. I don't know where to start writing code. Or, maybe you're somebody who works in PowerShell and knows a little Power CLI, but doesn't know how to take that next step. So this is really a sort of an art of the possible session. Here's what tools are there.
Yeah, and I guess one of the reasons that we've been running that session internally 8 or 9 times at VMware, and obviously right now there is a lot of focus around Kubernetes, and but I feel like we need to take a step back. Like Kubernetes is so complex, and there's that should be almost like the destination. But as part of your journey towards DevOps and the world of kind of cloud native application, you need to have established the foundations. So and that's kind of what we aim to address with this little hands-on, relaxed training that we're doing.
So I'm going to start with a little bit of Power CLI. It's one of the most common tools that you use to automate tasks against a VMware environment. And whenever you run a Power CLI command, what you're really doing on the back end is you're calling an API. But Power CLI hides the complexity of that API call for you, and it turns it into an easy to execute command line, which all of us as system administrators are pretty familiar with CLIs. So in the spirit of not touching Notepad, I know Cody will approve. We're going to do this all in VS Code. You don't have to. You certainly could use a PowerShell window, and you could open lab files in Notepad if you wanted. But don't. So we're actually going to show you Power CLI code. So you'll double click on VS Code, and you're going to open a folder, and everything here is in C lab files. So if you open C lab files labs, you will see all 3 labs. There's actually 4. There's a 4th one that I'll get to in a minute, but you'll see these 3. And you can pop open this text file, and this has all of the commands that we're going to run in this session. So if we pop open a new terminal right here, this is cool in VS Code because it gives you your code up here, and then it gives you a command window down here. So you don't have to Alt-Tab back and forth or have to use multiple monitors. So this is a simple line of code right here, connect VI server. We've got it all filled in the lab here, so you don't have to actually put in the URL, but right here, connect VI server, and it's sort of self-explanatory. What's the server name? How are we connecting HTTPS? What's the username and password, right? Very simple line of code. You don't have to know the backend API and how it's authenticating and how it works. All you know is you want to connect to a virtual center. And there it is, we connected. Now there's a ton of commands here in Power CLI. Get VM, right? It's a very simple command. What does it do? You don't even have to know it to know what it does. It's going to get VMs because it's self-explanatory command. So here's all the virtual machines that are running on our VMware Cloud and AWS Virtual Center. Since we haven't deployed any VMs on it, it's just going to be all the management components. So virtual centers running up there and all of our NSX components that makes the SDDC function. That's all out there. Get VM host. This is going to show you all of your connected servers, ESXi hosts. This is a single node SDDC, so there's just one host. So again, on the back end, Power CLI is invoking APIs, but you as the Power CLI developer or user admin, you don't have to know the API. You just have to know get folder is what I want. You just have to know the commands. So get folder, right? We're listing all the folders that are on our virtual centers. There's a ton of different get commands. And if you don't actually know what all the commands are, here's another command, get command. Show me all of the commands that are loaded as part of the VMware modules. And here's all of them, right? Tons of stuff, but a lot of them are sort of self-explanatory just by name. So again, it's abstracting all of the complexity of the underlying API and turning it into commands that you can run. So we're going to go back to get folder. And here's all of our folders listed. You can see there's a bunch of VM folders. One of them is a workloads folder. So the example here is we want to create a folder and we want to create it underneath the workloads folder. So the way that you do that in Power CLI, we're going to execute this command. And what is it doing? Get me a folder, get me the folder that's named workloads. And in PowerShell, a variable is prefixed with a $sign. Workloads folder. If I just type in that variable, we see we've gotten a folder object of type VM and it's named workloads. All right, cool. Now we want to create a new folder. So we're going to copy this line of code. Copy. Paste. What is this going to do? Well, new dash folder makes a new folder. Pretty obvious. This $env username, you might not recognize that, but admins are familiar with environment variables, and that's all this is. It's the environment variable that corresponds to your username. Where are we going to create the folder? I want to create it underneath the workloads folder. So if I actually typed env username, right, my username is Kremer because that's who I'm logged in as. So if I check vCenter, I should see underneath workloads a subfolder called Kremer, and there it is. So our code worked. So that's the first lab. Again, it's very simple, but it's highlighting that this command line utility, PowerShell, this command line module, set of command line modules for PowerShell, Power CLI, is abstracting the API calls and allowing you to interact programmatically against our vCenter. So simple example, but every admin I think that I know that's doing any sort of automation with VMware, they're using Power CLI for something. It's one of the first things I learned as an admin, and it's one of the first things that we teach new hires. We're getting a lot of at VMware. We have a lot of sort of new hires. We've got an academy program, people right out of school, and that's one of the first things that we teach is how to interact with it programmatically, but using Power CLI and abstraction. So that's the first lab. Which you guys will get into. We're going to assign you desktops in a little bit, so that you can actually remote in and do this stuff. Now this lab 2, another thing that I didn't sort of highlight, but what I am doing to open up a terminal window, you can hit the trash can to get rid of it. To get a terminal window that's right here in the correct folder, you can just right click on the file and do open an integrated terminal. So you can see my path right here is lab 2, right where the folder is. So lab 2, we're talking about Terraform. So Power CLI is used as a scripting tool. It's easy to pick up. It's great for bulk tasks. It's great for a brownfield environment. Terraform is an alternative. The use case is different, but we can do a lot of the same stuff. It can achieve sort of similar results. PowerShell and Power CLI, it's a series of scripts to execute a task, but Terraform is this entire infrastructure as code. You heard a lot today about people talking about as code, right? Do this as code. Terraform really is infrastructure as code, where you you define what you want in a file, and then you tell Terraform to go out and do it. So you might have heard people on the call talk about a Terraform provider, right? A Terraform provider is just a module of code that knows how to talk to a particular API. There's a Terraform provider for vSphere and vCenter. There's a Terraform, you heard on the call, people say there's a Terraform provider for F5, right? And it's really, somebody has sat down to take the time to figure out how to write code so that you in Terraform can literally just define it in plain language. So this is what a Terraform file looks like. The vSphere provider is what has been written for you to be able to interact with vSphere. Username, password, and the vCenter URL are pretty self-explanatory. If you have a self-signed SSL, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then there's a few other objects. What data center are we going to interact with? This is called a vSphere data center. And what do we want to do? So we're going to talk about folders today. What do we want to create in Terraform? We're going to create a folder. So we created a folder with Power CLI in the previous lab. And now we're going to create a folder in Terraform. It's all calling the same APIs on the back end. It's just a different way for you to interact with it. So kind of what we're trying to take you through as we show you this stuff and we go through these labs is it's all different ways. It's all different ways to call an API. That's what you're doing at the end of the day. So in Terraform, let's take a look at what we're going to do. So what do we actually want to do? We want to create a subfolder. So there'll be a Terraform folder here. So there's a top level folder Terraform that's already out there. And then what we want to do is I want to make a subfolder called Kremer, right? That's what I want to do. I want to make a Terraform subfolder of Terraform called Kremer. And there's just a couple commands that we need to do for Terraform. We have to initialize it. So Terraform init. And that's the command to initialize Terraform. It says it's ready to go. And really, you can just do Terraform apply. So two commands, Terraform init, Terraform apply. It's going to warn you, hey, look, I'm going to create this folder. It's going to be called Terraform Kremer. Do you want me to do it? I'm actually going to make a change to your infrastructure. Yes, done. And so, you know, in a couple lines, we've been able to create a folder. And if you look under here, there's the Kremer folder under Terraform. So it's not that hard to get started. You can get very complex with Terraform, right? You could describe out everything, folders and security, and build out an entire SDDC. It's great for spinning up labs and spinning down labs. You know, you have to be disciplined enough to do everything in code for the most part to use Terraform. It's not particularly designed for a brownfield. You can use it for brownfield sort of, but it's really more suited to Terraform manages everything. If you're gonna use Terraform, you're gonna make all your changes in Terraform and apply the changes to your infrastructure. We got questions in here. What do you all do? So the question in chat is, what do you do to play with the APIs of a full SDDC stack? You used to have a little home lab, but all of that plus NSX plus Tanzu, it's overkill just to play with the APIs. There is a thing called VC Sim, but it is limiting. I agree. And cloud instances are expensive. That's true. I agree. If you don't have if your employer doesn't have vCenter infrastructure to play with and have it all stood up, it can be difficult. One thing that people will use for free is hands-on labs to play with them. Obviously, that's not a long-term solution because you're limited to X number of hours in the HOLs. That's one free way to do it. And the home labbing stuff can get a little costly. I do know that there's a lot of people, there's always William Lamb runs like a community buy of Nooks. I know a lot of people are running decently sized home labs with relatively inexpensive Nooks. Can you get to the APIs and the HOL? So yes, for the vCenter ones and stuff, yes. For VMC, there aren't too many, there's not public internet access specifically. Well, I mean, most of the VMC labs are iSIMs anyway, so you're not gonna be able to hit the VMC API. Yeah, Michael's saying you can see my cabinet. It is ubiquity back there, so I figured, keep my cabinet visible. So that's a Terraform lab. Again, it's all just simple examples, but this is sort of what is possible. Now in lab 3,
and actually, just before you start, just on Terraform. So what we did here was the simplest example, right? Just create a VCF folder. That is easy. But there are providers, and Terraform uses something called a provider, which is almost like a plugin to interact with all the different types of clouds and infrastructure. So has a provider for Azure, for GCP, for AWS. And in the VMware world, where we've got vSphere, NSXT, VMware Cloud, vRealize Automation, the Cloud Director, that's the official providers, but we can also create your own. And that's something where it gets quite interesting is when, and it's all written in Go, so it's a bit of a learning curve with Go, but after a while, what you can do, and what I'm doing at the moment, is contributing to an existing provider or building your own provider. So there is a provider for HCX, for Network Insight, for Velo Cloud that are not official, but made by the community. And that may be something we can do in the next automation user group, is to do a hands-on lab session on how to build your own Terraform provider from scratch. We did a session at the Office of the CTO conference at VMware a couple of months ago, and we had about 90 people, and that went on pretty well. So yeah, that's on. The offer is on the table.
That sounds like you just signed up for our next meeting.
That'll be my pleasure.
Let's see. Lab 3 is on REST API. So, we showed you 2 different ways to consume the REST API in a more abstract way. And now you're actually going to see what a raw API call looks like. I didn't really know what an API was. I didn't need to as an infrastructure admin. I'd heard about it. It's a thing that developers use, but what is it actually under the hood? I had no idea till I started going down this path with some of the flings that I've been able to work on here at VMware. API is an application programming interface, and developers use it as they will create them as a programmatic way to interact with the product that they're publishing. The most sort of common API now is a REST API, which stands for Representation State Transfer. No one calls it that. You're just going to see it called REST everywhere, and I'm betting half the people in the world don't actually know what it stands for. Most common REST implementations use HTTP, so the same stuff that you're doing in your web browser, looking at web pages. Most modern APIs run on that same set of actions, and it's create, read, update, or delete. You'll recognize this if you've ever worked with databases, CRUD operations. Create, read, update, or delete. In REST API language, it's put, get, patch, and delete. A put creates something, a get reads something, a patch updates a configuration, and delete deletes. So, like I said, when you're browsing the internet, you're doing a get, you're pulling a web page down. If you submit a form, you're doing a post, which is kind of like a put. So in the lab, we are actually going to run the raw API. So you're actually going to see under the hood what exactly is happening. So we trash this terminal window. We can open an integrated terminal window here. Now, going back to this example, how did we get into the virtual center? We did a connect VI server. We passed it a URL, a username, and a password. Well, here's what's actually happening underneath the covers. So curl is a command line utility where you can just interact with raw APIs. So we are passing a username and password, the same username and password that we did to connect VI server. And we're passing it the same vCenter URL, but here we're actually passing it a path. And this is a path to the session token. So what really happens in Virtual Center is you pass usernames and passwords to vCenter, to this session service. It authenticates you, and then it gives you a session token. And then all future API calls for your session, you authenticate with that session token. So if we actually execute this curl command, you can see that it was success code 200. It's telling us to set a cookie named VMware API session ID. And if you actually look at the token, right, this is what it returned. So this is our little token here, 331 FDF, this little guy, that's our token. So our second command here is going to actually use that token, and that token is going to list out the folders. So basically it took the data in the token to authenticate itself to vCenter, and this URL here, REST vCenter folder, that's the folder API. And what did we get back? Well, we got all the folders, but we got it dumped in as raw, right? It's all raw JSON. Whereas when you ran like the Power CLI commands, it was all formatted for you, right? But this is really what's going on under the covers. And understanding how to do this and how to interact with a raw API is an important step in programming. So I think we're going to let you guys jump into the lab. There's a fourth lab here, a stretch goal. So if people finish these first couple labs, we can jump into the stretch goal. But it's Python. So we're actually there's a whole set of Python code here under C Git. If we open up the repo, the Start Coding Today repo, that's not what I wanted to do. But underneath C Git, there's Start Coding Today, and we have a Python folder under here, and there's a vCenter REST Python script. So if you are feeling advanced and you whip through the first 3 labs and you want to start fiddling around with Python, take a look at it and see what you can figure out. You should be able to plunk in the username and password from one of the other fields, run the Python script, and see what you get back. Python vCenter rest.py. But yeah, for now we're going to jump into the desktops, the live labs.
Right. So what we've done is you might have seen that I added a username to your Zoom participant name. So you get the AUG dash something. And that's your username to a virtual desktop which is exactly the same as the one Patrick was using. So let me just share a slide, explain some of this stuff. So we've got a Horizon VMware Horizon environment running on, and you can access it by going on desktop.vmc.ninja. Just go on your browser, and you get your username. So You all have your username, all the attendees. So AUG, for example, Christian, your AUG10, Frankie, your AUG08. And you can see the username here is VMC Rocks1. And you can just follow the same steps. I can just leave this here for you to consult. We've got 10-15 minutes and see if hopefully you can join. If you have any questions, just interrupt us.
Nico, how long would the labs be available if people want, if they don't have a hard stop?
You can go on. I mean, this evening is fine. No, just keep going.
Perfect.
Yeah, we can leave them up for a little while.
Yeah.
Again, the code afterward, right? If you want to play with it, the code is all there in that repo. So this is all stuff that you can use against your own vCenter. Any vCenter that you've got, all these examples will work against it. Obviously, you have to install the tools, so there's that hurdle that you'd have to get over. But the code is all there. Even the code that we're using to drive the session, there's other code in that repo. Like right now, we're using Slack to monitor how many people are logging in. That actual code is out there. So it's basically Power CLI code that checks Horizon, and it counts how many people have logged into that Horizon instance and spits it out through a Slack webhook. So that example's out there too.
And the fastest to complete all the tasks, I'm happy to send across a VMC on AWS networking book. I've got a lot left. I haven't been able to shift, so we could make it a bit more competitive.
Cool.
I just finished Lab 99.
That's cool. So you authored 95 labs for us. Sweet. Did you commit them all?
Ah, I knew I forgot something.
Oh, bloody.
I'm failing my life.
Yeah, going down this code route, I think, has been awesome for my career growth and development. Right, I was pretty much a pure sysadmin, and one day in 2019, William Lamb convinced me that I could learn this Kubernetes fling, this Viba fling, and so I started it off. And I'm hardly a Kubernetes expert, but because I took that one step playing around with the fling, now I know Git to a point, just like people were talking about on the phone. Am I an expert at the advanced functions? Absolutely not, right? I still panic when I have to do a merge. If I get a merge conflict, I flail around. Help me. But push, pull, update, pull request, that kind of stuff. I can do it now, and it's because I'm not afraid of that I have had other opportunities to do other things, like work on a fling with Nico and work on other open source things. And that's all because I just, I took one little step, one November day in 2019. And I learn every day. We just had this thing called a Borathon. It's an internal hackathon at VMware. And, I was fortunate to be paired up with like a real developer, like, a hardcore person who lives and breathes Python. And being able to spend that time, I've learned so much in Python just over 2 days of working on this thing. It probably was like a year of learning just taught to me, you know, all dumped in 2 days. So I mean, I would have never even considered, like, why would I join a borathon? Like, why would I join a hackathon with, you know, all of VMware's talented developers and like me? How do I even belong there? But I did it, and we got functioning code out of it, like actual working functioning code that we were able to add to our fling that we published today. So it's pretty cool stuff. It's Cody's talking about how you never know where you're going to end up. Like, I never thought I'd end up here, you know, publishing a fling. That's crazy talk. That didn't seem like a core skill that I ever would have, but here we are.
Yeah, but now fling, you know, started from nothing, right? And then now you look at our fling, we've got, you know, some big customers using it.
We do.
Which is pretty awesome, and it's being used internally. That was my second fling. I've got 3 flings now. My first one was a Python client for VMC, just an easy way to consume VMC, again, just using the APIs with a Python-based client. The second one, which we've done with Patrick, is a tool to save the configuration of an SDDC in VMware. It's mostly around the NSXT configuration, so it enables you to save and restore the configuration of an SXT, so all your security roles and groups and services. And I've released another thing recently, which is a tool to install the NSX AVI load balancer, as using Terraform, Ansible, Go, Python, and the front end is using Angular and the VMware Clarity framework. But again, you know, never would have thought I could contribute to projects like this when I started coding a few years ago. So yeah, just give it a shot. You never know where it will take you.
I think we actually have one finished, or at least he claims he's finished. I think you should check if he actually did it. So just that.
You know I did it.
Big claim, that.
Yeah. Too many years of PowerShell. So I'm just playing around with the Python stuff.
And that Python code, you know, I wrote, you know, line by line, and I commented it all, right? I intended for it to be very sort of teaching code. It's not generally how you would write a real program. You wouldn't comment to that depth and that depth of debugging, but I wanted to explain every single line and exactly what it's doing. But really what the Python is doing is it connects to that same session API that we did with curl, and it pulls down the same session token, and it connects to that same folder API that we used with curl, and it actually lists out the folders. So it's the same stuff, but it's how you would interact with the API if you needed to develop and code against the API to do something. Yeah. Kristen says your name. So you need to change that your username Terraform folder. You need to change that to aug10 aug10, your username, Kristen. And then run it again, and it should work.
Well, the company that I worked for, they took a choice last year. It is a networking company with that has a Cisco as a main supplier, but has just purchased a lot of companies in regards to security and VMware. And they took a choice last year to educate all consultancies within the company, about 300, in Python.
Nice.
So a 9-month training program, internal training program, each one has to go through. So it's so for me, coming from PowerShell, it's actually kind of nice just to try to transition to Python going forward.
It's a good question from Rami.
Sorry.
So yeah, it was just a good question about from Rami about like what do you guys recommend for getting started with Python? So there are lots of different kind of courses. I've got this book which I bought recently. Python for whoops, that was a blur. It's called Python for DevOps. That's really good, and that's more addressed for people like us. And Patrick, you said you've done a course called Python Essential Training. Learn Python the hard way. I guess the main thing is always, having a use case, right? That's always a key to be successful in any kind of automation project.
Yeah, I've never been able to learn a thing just to learn it, but in particular programming, right? I need a use case. I need a reason to do it. These things have been the reason.
Oh man, yeah. And I remember a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a couple of the VMworlds, and I caught wind of the that's when I started paying attention to more of the Twitterverse, right, and just everything, and William Lamb and that kind of stuff, and then all the events that went on at VMworld, and one of them was a hackathon. So I was like, man, I'm not at that level. I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna go. And then, but the very first time, like I heard about it, or it was the second one that I attended, and I went and I just attended it. I walked around. I said hi to a couple people a little bit, but yeah, I was just walking around and just meeting people and seeing what they were doing. And I was like, you know what, next year, and next year I went back, and I was walking around, and there was this group. There were just 3 dudes at a table, and they were looking for somebody, right, just to help them. And I was like, well, this table is empty, and I sat down, and I was like, hey, how can I help you guys? And cool, it was just getting there, right? It's like going to the gym. You can think about it, but if you get there, it's like, well, you're already here. You might as well. So this is super fun. I'm taking my notes. I'm taking my screenshots as I'm going through. This is really helpful.
Awesome. That's a really good story, man. I think it's a good example, right? I had the same sort of experience, right? Just maybe you can't write code. That's okay. You can test. You can write documentation. You can, play with what the developers wrote and get it to work. At a hackathon, you can present on the final, right? There's a lot of people who have no interest in public speaking, but if you have that skill, you can contribute that. Hey, fine, I'll make the slide deck and I'll present it, right? There's always, on any project, any hackathon, any open source, there's always stuff that can be done even if you're not a developer, and you'll pick it up. You'll start picking it up just by working with it.
An advice that I kind of learned a lot from is also looking at YouTube, because one thing is reading the code, another thing is seeing how other people actually work on it. And to me, that's probably what I learned the most from.
Yeah, and I mean that's actually what they do at Pivotal, which is now part of VMware and now referred to as Tanzu, but they do something called pair programming, right? And they put 2 Pivotal consultants together to program, because whenever you program with somebody else, you pick up something from, I work far faster when I'm coding alongside Patrick than just by myself. I can see what he's doing, and he's using VS Code in a way I don't know. So yeah, pairing with somebody else and doing share coding is good.
Yeah, like even things like this, right? The user group, this is new to me, right? And so yeah, I'm a part of other user groups, but not an automation one, right? It's like, whoa, those people, whoa, kind of thing. And but I'm in here, and I'm super excited for this, right, specific episode or presentation. But when he said we were doing it, and I'm like, okay, everybody do it, and I was like, oh my gosh. I had opened up my VS Code yesterday. I changed some sort of appearance, like the color, and my the menu bar up top disappeared. So I was like, what? And I was like, I felt like a total noob to like IT. I was like, how did it go away? And no matter what I did, so yeah, I Googled it, and like the second link that I showed up, it was like, oh, you press Alt, and it still went away. So yeah, it was like, oh no. So then today, as soon as you said we're gonna do it by ourselves, I was like, oh no, I need to have my VS Code ready. Yeah. So yeah, luckily it's inside the VM. So yeah, no pressure. I was so worried. Yeah.
If it makes it feel any better, it took me 2 days to figure it out when I did that. So
you gotta start somewhere.
all right, just a couple minutes left. You can keep going. Like Nico said, we'll leave the VMs up for a while, so you can keep playing around with it for a little bit. We'll shut them down later tonight. But again, all of the code is up there in the repo, so you have access to all this stuff. Obviously, you just need an environment, just a vCenter. Any vCenter will do.
That is perfect. So do you want to give people a couple of minutes to finish up, or?
Yeah.
And then just while people are doing that, I will just say that this recording, as people has been noticing on the chat, is not going to happen automatically. Or be published automatically. So tomorrow, when Zoom is finished, I don't know, creating the files, I will upload it to YouTube and I will share the link here. So if you want to see some of this again, then by tomorrow morning Danish time, that's 12-14 hours, something like that, you should be able to see it. So, and then other than that, we don't have anything else. I don't know, but you, Michael, do you have anything you want to say?
No, I mean, all the people on here, yes, there have been some, let's just say, luminaries of the automation world presenting this evening, and some of them are kind of intimidating in what they've done. But I think everybody's friendly, and the thing that makes these kind of user groups work is sharing your experiences, sharing something something about, sharing something you're passionate about, and we'd very much like to have lots of different speakers. So if anyone's got an interesting technology project, thing that they've worked on that they want to share, we would really love to have you on to talk about it. So it's almost like a verbal call for papers. But other than that, no, it's been brilliant. I've learned a lot. I've made some notes. I'm gonna have to go and look some stuff up now.
Yeah, and I just got a good hint, thanks Nico, to save the chat. So I will look through it, maybe not tomorrow morning, but I will look through it over the weekend and see if I can share some of the links. And again, we have everything on our GitHub page, and if you don't know how to participate in that and share links, if you have any good ones, then there's training in there, how to learn Git. So there's no reason not to get started. It's a good place to start. So, but I will stop the recording now and just say thank you for today.